They found Duke Caedric Ashborne bleeding in the rain outside his own fortress at dawn, locked out by his own guards, stripped of every title except the one carved into his bones by birth. The man who had ruled the northern territories with an iron fist for 12 years knelt in mud outside gates that no longer recognized his authority, while inside those walls his younger brother hosted a celebration breakfast with the very council members who had sworn loyalty to Caedric the night before. This is what power looks like when it dies. This is what happens when a man confuses fear with permanence. And if you think you understand how he clawed his way back from that moment, how he transformed betrayal into the most dangerous weapon in the kingdom, then you have never truly studied the anatomy of vengeance. Stay with this, because by the end you will understand why they still whisper his name in Parliament with the kind of reverence reserved for gods and monsters. The rain hammered against Caedric's shoulders as he pushed himself upright, mud streaking across the black wool of his greatcoat. 6 hours earlier, he had gone to bed as the Duke of Ashbourne, master of 300,000 acres, commander of the Northern Guard, and the single most feared political force between the Crown and the Scottish border. Now he stood outside Ravenscar Keep watching smoke rise from chimneys that no longer belonged to him. His brother Matthias appeared on the eastern rampart, backlit by torchlight, flanked by Captain Thorne and Lord Wessex. The same Lord Wessex who had dined at Caedric's table 4 nights ago, praising his strategic brilliance while secretly drafting the accusation documents that stripped him of command. Matthias leaned over the stone battlements, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical precision. "You should have seen this coming, brother. You really should have." Caedric said nothing. Speech required energy he could not afford to waste. Instead, he studied the faces along the rampart with the cold assessment of a general counting enemy forces. 12 council members, 8 senior officers. The Lord Chancellor himself, that fat bastard Grenville, standing beside the family attorney with documents already prepared, already signed, already executed. They had moved with surgical efficiency. While Caedric slept, they had locked the estate accounts, seized control of the household guard, and declared him mentally unfit to govern based on testimony from 3 physicians he had never met. The Chancellor had invoked an obscure clause in the Ashbourne family charter that allowed for emergency succession in cases of documented instability. All legal, all binding, all orchestrated by the younger brother he had protected his entire life. Matthias smiled down at him, rain dripping from his perfectly groomed beard. "Father always said you were too hard, too cold. He said it would cost you everything eventually. Turns out the old bastard was right about something. The truth was simpler and infinitely more vicious. Caedric had spent 12 years consolidating power through calculated brutality, eliminating rivals, crushing dissent, and ruling Ashbourne territory like a military occupation. He had believed fear created stability. He had been wrong. Fear creates patience, and patient men wait for the exact moment when a tyrant shows weakness. His weakness had arrived 3 months ago in the form of Elena Hartwell. Caedric turned away from the rampart without responding to Matthias and walked toward the forest line bordering the eastern road. Behind him, laughter echoed from the fortress, the sound of men celebrating liberation from a ruler they had obeyed but never respected. He had exactly 47 pounds in the leather bag tucked inside his coat, 1 pistol with 6 rounds. A signed letter of credit from a Swiss banker that would be worthless by noon once word spread through financial networks. And the knowledge that every ally he had cultivated over 12 years of ruthless governance would now distance themselves with the same speed they had once rushed to curry his favor. The old Caedric would have raged, would have gathered loyalists and marched on Ravenscar with violence and vengeance. But the old Caedric had died the moment Elena Hartwell walked into his study 6 weeks ago and asked him a question no one had dared speak in his presence for over a decade. "What are you so afraid of?" The memory burned hotter than the rain soaking through his clothes. He had met her at a parliamentary function in London, one of those insufferable gatherings where nobles performed civility while sharpening knives behind painted smiles. She had been standing near the beverage table, alone, watching the crowd with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying primitive behavior. Dark hair pulled back severely, gray eyes that tracked movement like a predator identifying weakness. Dressed in midnight blue silk that cost more than most families earned in a year. She was the orphaned daughter of Viscount Hartwell, A man who had gambled away his fortune and shot himself in his study rather than face bankruptcy. Elena had inherited nothing but debt and a minor title that meant precisely nothing in a system built on land and liquid capital. Yet she moved through that ballroom like she owned every chandelier, every politician, every whispered conversation. Caedric had approached her because he recognized something familiar in her expression, the look of someone who understood that society was a performance and had decided to master the theater rather than pretend it was real. "You're either extremely brave or catastrophically stupid," he had told her, gesturing toward the Prime Minister's nephew she had just insulted within earshot of half the room. Elena had turned those gray eyes on him with the kind of assessment that stripped pretense down to skeletal truth. "And you are the Duke who believes cruelty is leadership. I have read about your estate management practices. Efficient but soulless, like governing a factory instead of people. Most would have apologized immediately. Most would have recognized the danger in provoking a man who had destroyed careers for lesser insults." Elena simply waited for his response with the calm of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and accepted all of them. He should have walked away. Instead, he had spent the next 4 hours in conversation with her, discussing philosophy, military strategy, and the fundamental architecture of power with an intellectual precision he had not experienced since his university days. She challenged every assumption he stated as fact. She dismantled his arguments with ruthless logic. And when the evening ended, she had handed him her card with a simple instruction. "If you ever want to understand why your governance structure is slowly collapsing beneath you, write to me. I charge consultation fees that will offend you. But I'm very good at diagnosing terminal conditions in dying systems," he had written to her 3 days later. Within 2 weeks, she was living at Ravenscar Keep as his private political consultant. Within 4 weeks, she had identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in his power structure that his own advisors had either missed or deliberately concealed. Within 6 weeks, she had become the only person in the entire territory who could speak truth directly to his face without fearing retaliation. And Matthias had recognized exactly what that meant. His brother understood that Caedric was changing, that the brutal efficiency which had defined his rule was softening into something more complex, that Elena Hartwell represented a shift in priorities from absolute control to sustainable governance, and shifts in priority created openings for ambitious men willing to exploit them. So Matthias had moved with the precise timing of an assassin who understood his target's blind spots. Caedric reached the tree line and stopped, turning back to study Ravenscar Keep one final time. Smoke rose from the kitchens. Flags bearing the Ashborne crest still flew from the towers, but they would be replaced soon enough. Matthias would commission new banners, new symbols, a new era under new management. The rain intensified, sheeting down in silver curtains that turned the world into watercolor impressionism. A voice spoke from the shadows between 2 oak trees. "You know they will kill you if you stay in the north." Elena stepped out from the forest, wearing a traveling cloak the color of charcoal, her hair loose and rain-soaked, a leather bag slung across her shoulder. She looked like a refugee from a battlefield. She looked perfect. Caedric stared at her with the kind of shock that temporarily suspends rational thought. "You were supposed to leave for London yesterday." "I was supposed to do many things," Elena said quietly, moving closer until she stood directly in front of him. "I was supposed to maintain professional boundaries. I was supposed to treat you as a client and nothing more. I was supposed to recognize that getting involved with a man like you was strategic suicide. But apparently I am less rational than my reputation suggests. They threw you out too." It was not a question. Caedric could read the answer in the exhaustion shadowing her eyes, the mud on her boots, the absence of jewelry that had been present the night before. Elena smiled without humor. "Matthias offered me a very generous position as his senior advisor. Triple my current salary. Full access to estate resources. A permanent suite in the West Wing. All I had to do was publicly denounce you as mentally unstable and confirm the physician's reports. And you refused." She reached up and touched his face with fingers cold from rain and betrayal. "I told him to go fuck himself with a rusted sword." Direct quote. Lord Wessex actually gasped. It was tremendously satisfying. Despite everything, despite the ruins of his life smoking behind him, Caedric laughed. The sound was harsh and unfamiliar, like machinery that had not been used in years suddenly grinding back to life. You just destroyed your entire career for a man who has nothing left to offer you." Elena's expression shifted into something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous than simple affection. "You still do not understand what you are, do you? You think power is titles and land and the ability to make men obey. But I have watched you rebuild a failing agricultural system in 6 weeks. I have watched you negotiate treaty terms that 3 ambassadors could not resolve. I have watched you absorb information like a military computer and execute decisions with surgical precision. You are not powerful because you are a duke. You are powerful because of what exists inside your head. And that cannot be taken by parliamentary vote or family betrayal." She was wrong. She had to be wrong. Power without position was philosophy, and philosophy did not pay soldiers or influence parliament or rebuild fallen empires. But the way she looked at him suggested she understood something he did not. "They will hunt us," he said carefully. "Matthias cannot afford to leave me alive. Not after this. I know too much about the family operations, the smuggling networks, the bribes, the offshore accounts. If I testify before Parliament, I could destroy him." "Then we make sure you never have to testify," Elena replied. "We make sure you become so indispensable to the right people that killing you becomes more expensive than protecting you." "How?" She pulled a folded document from inside her cloak and handed it to him. The paper was damp but legible. A contract, signed by someone whose name made Caedric's blood stop moving. Lord Chancellor Grenville, he stared at the signature, then at Elena, then back at the document. "You met with Grenville, the same man who signed my removal order this morning." "I met with him last night," Elena corrected. 3 hours before the coup. He was very drunk and very indiscreet. Started bragging about how Matthias had offered him a permanent seat on the Ashborne Council in exchange for legal support. How they were going to carve up your territory like spoils of war, and you recorded the conversation. Better. I had a witness, his mistress, who happens to be the daughter of the Prime Minister's chief legal advisor, who is very interested in preventing her father from learning that she has been sleeping with a married chancellor twice her age. Caedric read the contract more carefully. It was a sworn affidavit detailing Grenville's involvement in an illegal conspiracy to defraud the Ashborne estate through fabricated medical testimony. Signed, dated, notarized. "This is leverage," he said slowly. "This is a loaded gun," Elena corrected, pointed directly at the head of the man who helped your brother steal your life. And Grenville knows it, which means he will do exactly what we tell him to do or watch his career disintegrate in front of the entire kingdom. "We?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since the coup, Caedric felt something other than rage or despair. He felt possibility. "You think I came out here just to hold your hand while you contemplated revenge? I came because we are going to burn your brother's empire to the ground and rebuild it into something that actually functions. But we do it smart, we do it surgical, and we do it in a way that makes every noble family in this kingdom understand that Caedric Ashborne does not lose. He adapts." The rain began to ease, shifting from downpour to steady drizzle. Behind them, Ravenscar Keep sat dark against the dawn sky, smoke rising from chimneys, guards patrolling walls that no longer recognized their former master. Caedric folded the document and tucked it inside his coat. "If we do this, if we go after Matthias and the council, it will be war, not parliamentary debate, not legal maneuvering, actual war." "Good," Elena said quietly, "because I am very tired of watching you pretend to be something you are not. You were never meant to be a politician, Caedric. You were meant to be a conqueror, so stop mourning what you lost and start taking what you deserve." She turned and walked back toward the forest, her cloak swirling in the wind. Caedric stood motionless for a long moment, watching smoke rise from the fortress that had been his prison and his kingdom for 12 years. Then he followed Elena into the trees, leaving Ravenscar Keep burning behind him in more ways than one. 3 weeks later, Lord Chancellor Grenville received a midnight visit from 2 individuals wearing traveling cloaks and carrying documents that would end his career if they reached the wrong hands. He cooperated with admirable speed. Within 72 hours, the medical testimony declaring Caedric mentally unfit was retracted due to procedural irregularities. Within a week, the Ashborne succession was under formal parliamentary review, but Caedric did not return to Ravenscar Keep. Instead, he did something infinitely more dangerous. He disappeared. While Matthias scrambled to consolidate power and defend against legal challenges, Caedric moved through the kingdom like a ghost, meeting with bankers Matthias had insulted, military commanders his brother had alienated, and noble families who remembered favors the old duke had granted years ago. He offered no threats, no demands, just information, evidence, opportunities. Elena moved beside him like a shadow, coordinating communications, identifying vulnerabilities, transforming Caedric's raw strategic instinct into executable precision. They operated from a rented townhouse in Edinburgh under false names, funding their campaign with money borrowed against future favors from men who understood that backing the right horse in a succession war could yield extraordinary returns. And slowly, methodically, they began to strangle Matthias's support structure. A banking consortium withdrew financing for Ashborne shipping operations after discovering Matthias had been falsifying profit reports. 3 senior military officers resigned from the household guard, citing ethical concerns about the succession process. 2 council members who had supported the coup suddenly developed serious reservations about the legal precedent it established. Matthias responded exactly as Caedric predicted, with escalating paranoia and increasingly visible brutality. He arrested suspected loyalists without evidence. He seized properties belonging to families who questioned his authority. He turned Ravenscar Keep into an armed fortress and surrounded himself with mercenaries whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their paychecks. Every excessive action pushed more allies toward Caedric. Every brutal overreach reminded the Northern Territories why they had tolerated the old Duke's cold efficiency in the first place. Because efficiency, no matter how ruthless, was preferable to chaos. 2 months after the coup, Caedric received a message from an unexpected source. General Marcus Blackwood, commander of the Northern Guard, requested a private meeting at a neutral location. They met in a coaching inn 15 miles south of Ravenscar, in a private room that smelled of old wood and older secrets. Blackwood was 60 years old, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had witnessed too many battles and retained scars from all of them. He sat across from Caedric without ceremony and placed a sealed letter on the table between them. From your brother, ordering me to hunt you down and kill you, offering a promotion and land grants as incentive. Caedric studied the seal without touching the document. And you came here to tell me this before or after you decided whether to accept? Blackwood smiled without humor. I came here because I have served the Ashborne family for 37 years. I watched your father build this territory from political irrelevance into one of the most powerful duchies in the kingdom. I watched you inherit that responsibility at 23 after he died, and every vulture in Parliament circled expecting you to fail. And I watched you not only survive but expand Ashborne influence beyond anything your father achieved. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes hard as gunmetal. Your brother is a politician playing dress-up as a duke. You are the real thing, cold as winter and twice as unforgiving, but real. So no, I am not going to kill you. I'm going to ask you what you need to take back what belongs to you. Caedric felt something shift in his chest. Not hope. Hope was for people who believed in justice. This was colder, more certain. This was mathematics. I need the guard, he said quietly. Not all of them. Just enough to make Matthias understand that holding Ravenscar by force is no longer viable. Can you deliver that? Blackwood reached into his coat and removed a second document. A list of names, officers, commanders, battalion leaders. 2/3 of the Northern Guard will follow my orders over your brothers. The other third are mercenaries he hired after the coup. They will fight if paid, but they will not die for him. Then we do not give them a reason to die, Caedric replied. We give them a reason to walk away. He looked at Elena, who had been standing near the window watching the road. She moved to the table and produced a folded paper from her bag. Matthias has been paying his mercenaries from the Ashborne Estate Reserve Fund, which is technically illegal without council approval for military expenditures. We have documentation proving he diverted over £40,000 without proper authorization. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. You have been busy. We have been thorough, Elena corrected. If you announce that the Guard is withdrawing support for Matthias based on his illegal use of estate funds, his mercenaries will panic. They will realize they are backing a commander who might not be able to pay them. And mercenaries without guaranteed payment tend to renegotiate terms very quickly. Or abandon ship entirely, Blackwood added. Caedric leaned back in his chair, the pieces assembling in his mind with the precision of a chess endgame. We do not storm Ravenscar. We do not need to. We simply demonstrate that Matthias no longer has the resources or authority to hold it. His support collapses. The council recognizes they backed the wrong succession, and Parliament reverses the removal order to avoid the embarrassment of having endorsed an illegal coup. Blackwood nodded slowly. Bloodless. Efficient. Your father would have approved. My father was a sentimental fool who died believing legacy mattered more than survival, Caedric said flatly. I am not interested in his approval. I am interested in results. The general stood and extended his hand. Then let us deliver some results, Your Grace. They shook. And in that moment, the war for Ashbourne reached its turning point. 4 days later, General Blackwood issued a formal statement withdrawing the Northern Guard's support for Duke Matthias Ashbourne based on documented evidence of illegal financial misconduct. The announcement was delivered simultaneously to Parliament, the Crown, and every major newspaper in the kingdom. Matthias responded by barricading himself inside Ravenscar Keep with his remaining mercenaries and threatening civil war if the Guard attempted to forcibly remove him. Caedric responded by doing nothing. He simply waited. Within 48 hours, the mercenaries began deserting. Within 72 hours, 3 council members publicly reversed their support for Matthias and called for immediate parliamentary review. Within a week, Lord Wessex was arrested on unrelated corruption charges that had mysteriously surfaced from sealed archives. And on the 8th day, Matthias Ashbourne walked out of Ravenscar Keep under armed escort, stripped of title and land, facing charges of financial fraud and conspiracy. The council formally requested that Caedric return to accept reinstatement as Duke of Ashbourne. He received the message while standing in the Edinburgh townhouse that had served as his headquarters for 3 months. Elena stood beside him, reading the same document, her expression unreadable. You won, she said quietly. Caedric stared at the formal request bearing the signatures of men who had betrayed him, begging him to return and restore order to a territory his brother had driven to the edge of collapse. No, he replied, I survived. There is a difference. He walked to the window overlooking the gray Edinburgh streets, watching rain begin to fall in patterns that reminded him of the morning he had knelt in mud outside his own fortress. When I go back, everything changes. The old system, the old methods, they are dead. Matthias proved that fear alone cannot hold power. It can only delay revolution. Then what replaces it? Elena asked. Caedric turned to face her, and for the first time in 3 months allowed himself to acknowledge the truth that had been growing since the moment she stepped out of the forest to stand beside him. Partnership. Real partnership. Not the performance version where I make decisions and you execute them. Actual shared governance where your intelligence has equal weight to my authority. Elena crossed the room until she stood directly in front of him. You are offering me power. I am offering you purpose, Caedric corrected. Power is what Matthias wanted. Purpose is what builds empires that last longer than a single generation. She studied his face with that same penetrating assessment she had used the night they met. And if I accept? If I return to Ravenscar as your partner instead of your consultant? What exactly does that make me? Caedric reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses on her fingers from weeks of writing correspondence and drafting strategic documents. It makes you the most dangerous woman in the Northern Territories. It makes you my co-architect in rebuilding everything my family spent generations destroying through arrogance and isolation. And it makes you the person I trust more than any council, any general, any institution in this entire corrupt kingdom. Elena smiled, and the expression carried enough sharpness to cut steel. Then I accept. On one condition. Name it. When we return to Ravenscar, when you walk through those gates as Duke again, you do not pretend the last 3 months did not happen. You do not go back to being the isolated tyrant who ruled through fear. You become something new, something they have never seen before. Which is? A leader who understands that true power is not making people obey. It is making them want to follow. Caedric pulled her close and kissed her with the kind of intensity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. Two damaged people who had found in each other the exact complement to their respective brilliance and brutality. When they finally pulled apart, Elena rested her forehead against his. They are going to hate this, you know. The council, the nobles, everyone who expects you to return as the same man who left. Good, Caedric replied. Let them hate it. Let them rage and scheme and plot. Because by the time they realize what we are building, it will be too late to stop it. 3 days later, Duke Caedric Ashborne returned to Ravenscar Keep. But he did not return alone, and he did not return as the man who had been thrown out into the rain. He returned as something infinitely more dangerous. A weapon that had learned to think, a tyrant who had discovered conscience, and a ruler who understood that the difference between power and legacy was the courage to share the throne. The gates opened, and inside those walls, every person who had celebrated his exile realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because Caedric Ashborne had not been destroyed by betrayal. He had been perfected by it. But perfection, as they would soon discover, came with a price. And that price would be paid in ways none of them could possibly anticipate. The council chamber at Ravenscar Keep had not changed in 3 months. Same oak panels carved with the Ashborne crest. Same high windows filtering gray northern light across a table built to seat 20 men engaged in the performance of governance. Same portraits of dead dukes staring down with painted contempt at the living who dared inherit their legacy. But the man sitting at the head of that table had changed completely. Caedric watched 12 council members file into the chamber with expressions ranging from nervous relief to barely concealed hostility. They had spent 3 months learning to obey Matthias through fear of immediate consequences. Now they would learn something infinitely more complicated. How to serve a duke who had stopped pretending authority and position were the same thing. Lord Pemberton entered first, 60 years old, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that suggested he still believed titles mattered more than competence. He had been the first to sign Matthias's succession documents, the first to declare Caedric mentally unfit, the first to celebrate his exile. He took his seat without meeting Caedric's eyes. Behind him came Viscount Halford, the estate treasurer who had helped Matthias falsify financial records. Then Lord Ames, who had provided the fabricated medical testimony. Then the others, each carrying the weight of betrayal like stones sewn into their expensive coats. Elena stood near the western window, not seated at the table, but positioned where every man in the room could see her. She wore charcoal gray silk, her hair pulled back severely, no jewelry except a single silver pin that marked her as Caedric's official political advisor. The title meant nothing legally. The presence meant everything strategically. General Blackwood stood opposite her, arms crossed, his uniform bearing the insignia of the Northern Guard. He was not technically part of the council, but he commanded 8,000 soldiers, which made his attendance more relevant than half the noblemen sweating into their chairs. Caedric let the silence build until it became physically uncomfortable, until men started shifting weight and clearing throats and looking anywhere except directly at him. Then he spoke. Matthias is being held in Edinburgh pending trial for financial fraud and conspiracy. The Crown has formally recognized my reinstatement as Duke of Ashbourne. Parliament has closed its investigation into the succession dispute, which means legally we are exactly where we were 3 months ago. He paused, letting that sink in. Legally. Lord Pemberton found the courage to speak first. Your Grace, the Council acted in what we believe to be the best interests of the territory. The physicians provided documentation that suggested you found an opportunity to replace a difficult duke with a manageable one, Caedric interrupted. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this was anything other than a calculated political coup. You wanted Matthias because he promised you autonomy, because he told you I was too controlling, too ruthless, too unwilling to let you conduct business without oversight. He stood, moving around the table with the measured pace of a general inspecting troops he intended to discipline. And he was right. I was all of those things. I ruled this territory like a military occupation because I believed fear created stability. I was wrong. Fear creates patience. And patient men wait for the exact moment when a tyrant shows weakness before they put a knife in his back. Viscount Halford spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. What happens now? Do you intend to execute us for treason? Caedric stopped directly behind Halford's chair. Execution would be inefficient. You possess skills and connections that benefit Ashborne interests. Killing you would waste those resources while simultaneously creating martyrs that my enemies could rally around. So no, Viscount, I'm not going to execute you. The relief on Halford's face lasted exactly 3 seconds. I am going to own you. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Caedric moved back to the head of the table, placing both hands flat on the polished wood. Every man in this room participated in an illegal conspiracy to defraud the Ashborne estate. You signed documents, you provided false testimony, you diverted funds. And while Matthias will face criminal charges, the rest of you exist in a legal gray area where prosecution is possible but not guaranteed. He let that information settle. Unless someone with direct knowledge of your involvement decides to testify against you, someone like, for example, the Duke you tried to destroy. Lord Ames went pale. You are blackmailing us. I am establishing clarity, Caedric corrected. You made a choice 3 months ago to betray your oaths for personal gain. I am simply making certain you understand the consequences of that choice extend beyond this moment. Your futures, your reputations, your family legacies, they all depend entirely on how useful you make yourselves to me going forward. Elena spoke from her position by the window, her voice carrying across the chamber with surgical precision. Blackmail requires threats. The Duke is offering you an opportunity. Continue serving Ashborne interests with actual competence instead of performative loyalty, and your involvement in the coup remains a private matter. Fail to meet expectations, and the documentation detailing your crimes becomes very public very quickly. Lord Pemberton's face flushed red with rage, barely held in check. This is tyranny. This is exactly the kind of autocratic governance that led us to support your brother in the first place. Caedric smiled without warmth. No, Lord Pemberton. Tyranny is what you experienced under Matthias. Arrests without evidence, seized properties, rule through panic and escalating brutality. What I am offering is a contract. Perform your duties with honesty and skill, and you will prosper under my governance. Betray me again, and you will face consequences so severe that exile will seem merciful by comparison. He moved to the window where Elena stood, positioning himself so every man in the room had to look at both of them simultaneously. But understand this. I am not the same Duke who left Ravenscar 3 months ago. The old system is dead. The old methods are buried with it. What comes next will require every person in this territory to adapt or be replaced. Starting with this council. General Blackwood spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded men in actual combat rather than political theater. Half of you collaborated with Matthias because you thought the Duke was weak. The other half collaborated because you were greedy. Both assumptions were mistakes. Duke Caedric is neither weak nor interested in your greed. He is interested in results. Deliver them, and you will discover he can be far more generous than his brother ever promised to be. Fail, and you will learn why the Northern Guard follows his orders instead of yours. Silence fell across the chamber like a blade. Caedric studied each face systematically, reading fear, reading calculation, reading the exact moment when survival instinct overrode pride. Lord Pemberton was the first to break. What do you require from us, Your Grace? Honesty, Caedric replied. Complete financial transparency. No more falsified records. No more diverted funds. Every transaction documented and available for review. Second, I want recommendations within 2 weeks on how to restructure estate operations to increase productivity without increasing tenant burden. Third, I want each of you to identify one corrupt practice currently happening within your respective domains and present a plan to eliminate it. He paused. And fourth, I want you to understand that Elena Hartwell is not my mistress or my secretary or any other diminished role you might assign to a woman in this chamber. She is my political architect. She has authority to review your work, question your decisions, and override your recommendations if she determines they conflict with Ashborne interests. You will treat her input with the same respect you show me, or you will discover very quickly how replaceable council positions actually are. The fury on Lord Pemberton's face was visceral. A woman. An orphaned nobody with no title and no land, granted authority over men who could trace their bloodlines back 6 centuries. But he swallowed that fury and nodded. "As you command, your grace." The others followed suit, one by one, bowing their heads to the new order, even as they calculated how to undermine it the moment opportunity presented itself. Caedric dismissed them with a gesture. They filed out like prisoners granted temporary parole, leaving only Blackwood and Elena in the chamber. The general approached the table and poured himself whiskey from the crystal decanter near the window. That was brutal. Efficient, but brutal. "It was necessary," Caedric replied. "They need to understand that betrayal has permanent consequences. Otherwise, we will be fighting the same battle every 6 months." Elena moved to stand beside him, her expression unreadable. "They hate me." Every man in that room looked at me like I was a plague rat contaminating their exclusive club. "Good," Caedric said quietly. "Let them hate you. Hatred means they recognize your power. Indifference would be far more dangerous." She studied his face with that penetrating assessment that always seemed to see past whatever performance he was delivering. "You enjoyed that. Watching them squirm, forcing them to accept me as their equal." "I enjoyed establishing control," Caedric corrected. "There is a difference." "Is there?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "I should inspect the guard rotations. Make sure the men understand the new command structure." He left without waiting for dismissal, closing the heavy oak door behind him. Elena crossed her arms, still watching Caedric with those gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "You are walking a very narrow line between strategic dominance and pathological control. You understand that, correct?" "I understand that 3 months ago I was thrown out of my own home because I failed to recognize threats growing inside my own council. I understand that mercy and weakness look identical to men like Pemberton. And I understand that if I do not establish absolute authority now, immediately, we will be fighting rebellions for the next decade." He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "You asked me not to return as the same man who left." "I did not. But transformation does not mean softness. It means knowing when to be brutal and when to be strategic. Today required brutality. And tomorrow?" Elena's voice was quiet but carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Tomorrow we start rebuilding. But the foundation has to be solid, and solid foundations require fear. Fear or respect, both. They are not mutually exclusive." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just remember that the man who rules only through fear eventually runs out of people willing to be ruled. Your brother proved that." Caedric reached up and touched her face, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Which is why I have you. To remind me when strategy crosses into tyranny. And if I fail, if you ignore my warnings, then you walk away. I will not chain you to a sinking ship." Elena smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. "I do not walk away, Caedric. I burn the ship myself and build a better one from the wreckage. Remember that before you decide I am too valuable to listen to." She turned and left the chamber, her footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Caedric stood alone in the empty council room, surrounded by portraits of dead dukes who had believed legacy mattered more than survival. His father stared down from the largest frame, painted in formal military dress, looking every inch the noble statesman who valued honor above pragmatism. "You would be ashamed of me," Caedric said to the portrait. "You built this estate on principles and died believing those principles would outlast you. But principles do not survive contact with ambitious brothers and corrupt councils. Only power survives, and I intend to wield it until there is no one left who questions whether I deserve it." The painted eyes offered no judgment, no approval, just the eternal silence of men whose opinions had died with them. Caedric poured himself whiskey and stood by the window overlooking the northern cliffs. Rain was moving in from the sea, great dark clouds that would drench the territory by nightfall. Somewhere in Edinburgh, Matthias sat in a cell awaiting trial, probably plotting, definitely planning some final desperate move to reclaim what he had lost. Let him plot. Let him plan. The game was over. Matthias had lost the moment he mistook his brother's evolution for weakness. But other threats remained. 3 noble families had supported the coup financially. They would need to be neutralized before they tried again. Two members of parliament had publicly called for Caedric's permanent removal. They would require persuasion or replacement. And somewhere in London, political enemies were watching Ravenscar very carefully, waiting to see if the Duke's return represented strength or the last gasp of a dying power structure. The work would never end. That was the truth no one told you about power. It was not a destination. It was an endless campaign of threat assessment and strategic response. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Elena returned carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. I spoke with the household staff. Half of them are terrified you are going to execute them for serving Matthias. The other half are terrified you are going to replace them with people loyal only to you. And what did you tell them? That their terror is justified, but their employment is not currently at risk. I also told them that competence matters more than loyalty, and that the quickest way to lose their positions is to lie about estate operations. She dropped the portfolio on the table with a heavy thud. Financial records from Matthias's administration. 3 months of absolutely catastrophic mismanagement. He spent £40,000 on mercenaries. Another $20,000 on bribes to silence potential opposition. He diverted estate revenue to personal accounts. He canceled infrastructure projects your father started. And he authorized pay raises for council members while cutting wages for field workers. Caedric flipped through the documents, his anger building with each page. He bankrupted half the estate in 3 months. Not quite bankrupted, but close. The reserve fund is depleted. The shipping operations are bleeding money. Tenant loyalty is at historic lows because he raised rents while reducing services. It will take years to repair the damage. Then we start immediately, Caedric said. Cancel the council pay raises. Restore worker wages. Resume the infrastructure projects. And send a message to every tenant family explaining exactly why their rents increased and who is responsible. That will humiliate Matthias publicly. That is the point. I want every person in this territory to understand that his governance was not just illegal, it was incompetent. Elena made a note on the document. The council will resist the pay cuts. The council will accept the pay cuts or resign. I am not interested in negotiating. She looked up from her notes. You are angrier than I expected. I thought you would be satisfied with victory. Victory is not the same as justice, Caedric replied. Matthias stole 3 months from me. 3 months I could have spent implementing reforms, strengthening alliances, building something that lasted. Instead, I spent those months surviving while he played Duke and destroyed everything our family built over 6 generations. He slammed the portfolio shut. So no, I am not satisfied. I am furious. And that fury will fuel every decision I make until Ashborne is stronger than it has ever been, and every person who supported that bastard understands they backed the wrong succession. Elena studied him with an expression he could not quite read. Revenge is expensive. It costs time, resources, and focus that could be directed toward actual governance. This is not revenge. This is deterrence. I need every noble family in the North to understand that challenging Ashborne authority results in complete annihilation. And when you have annihilated everyone, when there is no one left willing to challenge you, what then? Then we build, Caedric said quietly. But first, we burn. The next 6 weeks unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Caedric restructured the entire council system, removing 3 members who refused to meet transparency requirements, and replacing them with younger administrators who valued competence over tradition. He installed Elena as chief political strategist with full authority to review and override financial decisions that conflicted with long-term stability goals. He reorganized the household guard, promoting officers based on merit rather than family connections. The Northern Territories responded with cautious optimism mixed with deep suspicion. Tenant families welcomed restored wages and resumed infrastructure projects, but remembered 12 years of brutal efficiency under the old regime. Noble families who had supported Matthias quietly liquidated assets and prepared for retaliation that never arrived because Caedric was too busy rebuilding to waste time on punishment. And slowly, grudgingly, Ashborne began to stabilize. But stability attracted attention. 6 weeks after his return, Caedric received an invitation from Lord Chancellor Grenville to attend a private dinner in London. The same Grenville who had signed the removal order. The same Grenville whose affair Elena had documented and weaponized. The invitation was polite, formal, and absolutely unavoidable. Caedric showed the letter to Elena while they reviewed shipping manifests in his study. She read it twice, then set it down with deliberate care. This is a trap. Obviously. Then why are you considering attending? Because refusing sends a message that I am afraid of Parliament, and fear is the one thing I cannot afford to project right now. Elena stood and moved to the window, her silhouette backlit by gray afternoon light. Grenville wants to assess whether you are a threat or an asset. If he determines you are too powerful or too unpredictable, he will move against you through legal channels. If he determines you are controllable, he will try to recruit you into whatever political scheme he is currently orchestrating. And if I am neither, then he will try to destroy you preemptively before you become a problem he cannot manage. Caedric leaned back in his chair, considering the variables. What would you recommend? Go to London. Meet with Grenville. Let him think he is assessing you while you assess him. Identify his vulnerabilities, map his alliances, and prepare contingencies for every possible outcome. She turned from the window. But do not go alone. Take me with you. That will provoke exactly the kind of scandal we are trying to avoid. Unmarried Duke traveling to London with his female political advisor. Exactly, Elena replied. Let them gossip. Let them assume I am your mistress. Let them underestimate me while I gather intelligence they would never share in my presence if they recognized how dangerous I actually am. Caedric studied her face, searching for doubt and finding none. You enjoy this. The manipulation, the strategic positioning, the performance of weakness while accumulating power. I enjoy winning, Elena corrected, and winning requires using every advantage available, including the advantage of being underestimated by men who think intelligence and femininity are mutually exclusive. 2 weeks later, they arrived in London during the height of the social season. The city glittered with gaslight and ambition, every street corner hosting another aristocratic family, climbing toward influence while others slid into irrelevance. Parliament was in session, which meant every nobleman with political aspirations had migrated south to wage war through legislation instead of armies. Lord Chancellor Grenville hosted them at his townhouse in Mayfair, a marble monument to wealth accumulated through strategic marriages and careful blackmail. The dinner party included 8 guests, 2 members of Parliament, a banking magnate, the Secretary of War, and 3 noblewomen whose functions seemed entirely decorative. Grenville greeted Caedric with warmth so false it bordered on parody. Your Grace, such a pleasure to see you recovered from your recent difficulties. We were all terribly concerned about the succession dispute. Caedric shook his hand with the minimum pressure required by etiquette. Your concern was evident in the removal order you signed, Lord Chancellor. Grenville laughed as if Caedric had told a delightful joke. A procedural necessity, I assure you. When the Council presents medical documentation, we must act in the estate's best interest, but I am delighted the matter resolved itself so cleanly. He turned his attention to Elena with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at market. And this must be Miss Hartwell. Your reputation precedes you, my dear. I understand you have been instrumental in the Duke's political recovery. Elena smiled with exactly the right amount of deference to seem harmless. The Duke's recovery was entirely his own achievement, Lord Chancellor. I merely provided administrative support. Grenville's expression suggested he believed that approximately as much as Caedric did. They moved into the dining room, a cathedral of crystal and silver where servants moved with choreographed precision. Caedric was seated between the Secretary of War and one of the decorative noble women. Elena was positioned at the opposite end of the table, surrounded by men who immediately began patronizing her with questions about estate management that assumed she knew nothing about finance or governance. She answered each question with carefully measured ignorance, playing the role of competent assistant elevated beyond her natural abilities by a duke too distracted by his brother's betrayal to recognize her limitations. Caedric watched her performance while engaging the Secretary of War in a conversation about military supply contracts that was actually a negotiation about northern trade routes. Grenville presided over the dinner like a conductor leading an orchestra, steering conversations toward topics he wanted explored, deflecting subjects that threatened to become too revealing. He was testing Caedric, measuring his temperament, assessing whether the Duke who had survived a coup and returned to power represented an opportunity or a threat. Halfway through the third course, Grenville finally made his move. I imagine you have thoughts about the proposed military expansion into the Scottish territories, Your Grace. The northern border has always been somewhat volatile. Caedric set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. The northern border is volatile because Parliament keeps authorizing military actions without securing supply lines or local support. You cannot occupy territory through force alone. You need infrastructure, economic incentive, and governance structures that give people a reason to accept Crown authority. One of the Parliament members spoke up, his tone dismissive. With respect, Your Grace, military strategy is somewhat outside the purview of estate management. With respect, Caedric replied, his voice dropping several degrees in temperature, I commanded the Northern Guard's strategic operations for 6 years before my father died. I have more direct combat experience than anyone currently sitting in Parliament. So when I tell you that the proposed expansion will fail because you have not addressed fundamental logistical deficiencies, I am not offering an opinion. I am stating a fact. The table went silent. Grenville smiled like a man who had just confirmed a hypothesis. Then perhaps you would be willing to consult on the expansion plans? The Crown would value input from someone with your expertise. Translation. Grenville wanted Caedric invested in a parliamentary initiative so he could control him through political obligation. Caedric considered the offer for exactly 3 seconds. I would be willing to review the plans and provide recommendations, but I do not accept consulting positions that compromise my ability to govern Ashborne independently. Of course, Grenville agreed smoothly. Purely advisory. No formal commitment required. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but the real negotiation had concluded. Grenville had made his assessment. Caedric was too competent to dismiss, but too independent to control easily, which meant the Lord Chancellor would now pivot to a different strategy. Recruitment or isolation. Either bring Caedric into the parliamentary power structure or cut him off from resources and alliances until he became irrelevant. After dinner, while the men retired to Grenville's study for brandy and cigars, Elena slipped away under the pretense of needing air. Caedric found her 20 minutes later on the terrace overlooking the garden, standing in shadows that concealed her expression. "Learn anything useful?" he asked quietly. "The noble women were far more informative than expected," Elena replied. "Apparently Grenville is drowning in debt from gambling losses. He has been liquidating properties quietly to avoid public scandal, which explains why he is so interested in securing your cooperation. He needs allies with actual resources." "Leverage. Always leverage," Elena confirmed. "The man who appears most powerful is often the most desperate." Caedric moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "He is going to try to isolate us. I could see it in his expression when I refused the consulting position. He will work to block Ashborne trade agreements, delay parliamentary approvals we need, and generally make governance as difficult as possible. Then we make him need us more than we need him," Elena said simply. "How?" She turned to face him fully. "By becoming indispensable to the one thing he cannot afford to lose, his reputation. We document his financial instability. We trace his gambling debts. We identify everyone he owes money to, and then we quietly pay off those debts ourselves. That will cost a fortune. Yes, but it will also make Grenville completely dependent on our discretion. He cannot attack us without risking exposure of his financial collapse. And dependency is far more reliable than fear." Caedric studied her face in the dim light filtering from the townhouse windows. "You are frighteningly good at this." "I had excellent teachers," Elena replied. "Poverty is the best education in power dynamics. When you grow up with nothing, you learn very quickly how to identify what people need and position yourself as the only source capable of providing it." Before Caedric could respond, footsteps approached from inside. They separated smoothly, resuming the physical distance expected of a duke and his advisor. Grenville emerged onto the terrace with 2 brandy glasses. "Forgive the interruption. I thought you might enjoy the night air." "London can be suffocating this time of year." He handed one glass to Caedric, completely ignoring Elena's presence. "I wanted to speak privately, Your Grace, about the succession matter. Your brother's trial is scheduled for next month. There is some concern about what he might reveal during testimony." "Concern from whom?" Grenville smiled without answering directly. Matthias had connections to several parliamentary figures who would prefer their associations remain private. If you could see your way to convincing him to accept a plea arrangement rather than demanding a public trial, certain parties would be very grateful. Translation. Matthias knew where bodies were buried, and Grenville needed him silenced before he started talking. Caedric took a slow sip of brandy, letting Grenville sweat. My brother conspired to steal my title and destroy my family legacy. Why would I help him avoid consequences? Because helping him helps you, Grenville said quietly. The trial will be ugly. Family secrets will emerge. Ashbourne's reputation will suffer regardless of the verdict. But a quiet plea agreement preserves dignity for everyone involved. And what do I receive in return for this preservation of dignity? Grenville's expression shifted into something sharper. Parliamentary support for your estate initiatives, favorable trade agreements, access to crown resources currently unavailable to independent duchies, and most importantly, the friendship of people who remember favors. Caedric set down his glass. I will consider your proposal, Lord Chancellor, but understand something. I do not trade justice for convenience. If Matthias accepts a plea arrangement, it will be because he recognizes he has no alternative, not because I negotiated leniency on his behalf. Grenville nodded slowly, clearly disappointed but not surprised. Of course, Your Grace. I would expect nothing less. He retreated back into the townhouse, leaving Caedric and Elena alone on the terrace. Elena spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. He is terrified. Whatever Matthias knows, it is significant enough to destroy multiple political careers. Which means we now have two options, Caedric replied. Help Grenville silence my brother and gain parliamentary support, or let Matthias testify and watch half of London's power structure collapse into scandal. The second option serves justice. The first serves pragmatism. Caedric turned to face her. Which would you choose? Elena met his eyes with absolute clarity. I would choose power. Justice is noble, but power is what keeps you alive long enough to implement justice. Right now, you need allies more than you need revenge. Even if those allies are corrupt, especially if those allies are corrupt. Corruption creates dependency, and dependency creates control. Caedric looked back toward the glittering townhouse where Grenville was almost certainly calculating his next move. 3 months ago, I would have let Matthias burn, would have enjoyed watching him take half of Parliament down with him. And now? Now I understand that survival requires compromise, not moral compromise, strategic compromise, knowing when to be ruthless and when to be patient. He offered Elena his arm. We return to Ravenscar tomorrow, and then we decide whether my brother lives or dies based entirely on what serves Ashbourne interests best. They walked back into the townhouse together, leaving the darkness of the terrace behind. But darkness, as they would both learn, has a way of following you home. 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Ravenscar Keep carrying a letter sealed with the Ashbourne family crest. From Matthias. Caedric read it alone in his study while rain hammered against the windows. Brother, I know you think this is over. I know you believe you have won, but victory is not the same as security, and security requires eliminating every person who knows where the bodies are buried. Think carefully before you let me testify, because if I burn, I take everyone with me, including you. The letter was unsigned but unmistakably authentic. Caedric stood at the window overlooking the cliffs, watching waves crash against rocks that had witnessed 6 generations of Ashbourne dukes rise and fall. His brother was right. Matthias knew everything, every bribe, every illegal transaction, every secret their father had buried to preserve the family legacy. If he testified openly, the resulting scandal would not just destroy political careers, it would destroy the Ashbourne name itself. Caedric had 2 choices: save his brother to save his family, or sacrifice both and rebuild from ashes. The rain intensified until the world beyond the window disappeared entirely into silver static. And in that moment, standing alone in the study where his father had once ruled with honor and principles, Caedric Ashborne made the decision that would define every day of his life that followed. He walked to his desk, pulled out fresh parchment, and began writing. Not to Matthias, to the Crown Prosecutor, authorizing full cooperation with the investigation, providing documentation of every crime Matthias had committed, and requesting maximum sentencing under existing law. His brother wanted to burn the world. Caedric would let him. But the Ashborne legacy would survive, because legacy was not built on secrets buried in darkness. It was built on the courage to walk through fire and emerge transformed. The Crown Prosecutor received Caedric's documentation at dawn on a Tuesday that would later be remembered as the day half of Parliament stopped sleeping soundly. 23 pages detailing every financial crime Matthias had committed during his 3-month reign. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, falsified ledgers, bribery receipts signed in his own hand, and beneath that evidence a separate folder containing something far more dangerous: documentation of their father's crimes. Caedric had spent 2 weeks in the Ashborne archives extracting every secret the old duke had buried to preserve family honor. Illegal arms sales to Scottish rebels, tax evasion schemes involving shell companies in 3 countries, blackmail operations targeting rivals who threatened Ashborne shipping monopolies. Their father had built the duchy's wealth on foundations constructed from fraud and intimidation, then died believing legacy meant something more noble than survival. The old man had been a hypocrite, and Caedric had just proven it to the entire kingdom. He sealed the documents himself, watched the courier ride south toward London, and returned to Ravenscar Keep knowing he had just committed an act that would either secure his position permanently or destroy everything his family had built over 6 generations. Elena found him in the study 3 hours later, staring at rain streaking down the windows. "You sent it." It was not a question. Every page, Caedric confirmed. Matthias wanted to burn the world. So I gave the Crown Prosecutor the matches and pointed him toward everything flammable. She moved to stand beside him, her reflection ghostly in the rain-wet glass. "Your father's crimes are in those documents. When this becomes public, the Ashborne name will be synonymous with corruption. Good. Let it burn. Let every noble family in the kingdom see what happens when you build power on secrets instead of strength. My father believed reputation mattered more than truth. I'm proving him wrong." Elena studied his face with an expression he could not quite interpret. "This is not strategy. This is rage. You are destroying your own legacy to punish a dead man and a brother who is already defeated." "I am destroying a legacy that deserves to die," Caedric replied. "Everything my father built was performance, nobility without substance, honor without honesty. He taught me that power meant controlling perception. But perception is just another word for lies that people agree to believe. And what replaces those lies? Truth. Brutal and unforgiving. The kind of truth that makes men choose between supporting a duke who admits his family's crimes or aligning themselves with the corruption everyone pretends does not exist." He turned to face her directly. "I am betting that honesty, no matter how ugly, is more valuable than reputation. Because reputation can be destroyed by a single scandal. But honesty creates a foundation that cannot be undermined by exposure." Elena held his gaze for a long moment. "You are gambling everything on the belief that people respect transparency more than they fear embarrassment. That is an optimistic assessment of human nature. Then I am about to discover whether optimism or cynicism governs this kingdom." 3 days later, the story broke across every newspaper in London. Duke of Ashborne exposes family corruption in unprecedented testimony. The articles contained details so specific, so methodically documented, that denial was impossible. Matthias's crimes, their father's crimes. 6 generations of Ashborne dukes who had ruled the northern territories through strategic brutality disguised as noble governance. Parliament erupted into chaos. Half the legislature demanded immediate sanctions against the Ashborne estate. The other half scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, terrified that their own family secrets might surface next. Lord Chancellor Grenville issued a statement expressing shock and disappointment while quietly burning correspondence that connected him to the old Duke's blackmail network. And in Edinburgh, Matthias sat in his cell reading the newspaper accounts with an expression that witnesses later described as transcendent fury. The trial began 2 weeks later in a courthouse packed with journalists, politicians, and spectators hungry for the kind of public destruction that rarely involved nobility. Matthias entered wearing prison gray instead of aristocratic finery, his face gaunt from weeks of confinement, his eyes carrying the flat hatred of a man who had lost everything and decided to take revenge on existence itself. Caedric sat in the gallery beside Elena, watching his brother stand before a judge who looked like he would rather be presiding over anything other than the collapse of one of the kingdom's oldest families. The prosecutor was a woman named Margaret Thorne, 50 years old with silver hair and a reputation for dismantling corporate fraud with surgical precision. She approached the bench with the leather folder containing the documentation Caedric had provided. Your Honor, the Crown will demonstrate that the defendant, Matthias Ashborne, engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud the Ashborne estate through falsified financial records, illegal transfers of duchy funds, and fabricated medical testimony designed to remove his brother from lawful governance. Matthias's attorney, an expensive London lawyer named Harrison Webb, stood immediately. Your Honor, the defense will show that my client acted in good faith based on legitimate concerns about the Duke's mental stability and governance practices. Furthermore, we intend to demonstrate that the evidence provided by the Duke himself is tainted by personal vendetta and should be considered unreliable. The judge, a stern man named Lord Justice Pembroke, looked between the prosecutor and defense attorney with the exhaustion of someone forced to referee a family murder dressed up as legal procedure. Proceed, Prosecutor Thorne. What followed was 3 days of testimony so detailed, so methodically brutal, that even the journalists grew uncomfortable. Bank statements showing Matthias diverting £40,000 to offshore accounts. Physician testimony revealing that the medical reports had been purchased for £500 each. Council members admitting under oath that they had supported the coup because Matthias promised them autonomy and profit sharing. And through it all, Matthias sat silent, his expression never changing, watching the prosecution build a case so airtight that conviction was mathematically inevitable. On the 4th day, Harrison Webb called his only witness, Matthias Ashborne. The courtroom went absolutely still. Matthias stood and walked to the witness stand with the careful precision of a man who had spent weeks planning exactly what he would say. He was sworn in. He sat. And then Harrison Webb asked him a single question. Mr. Ashborne, did you conspire to remove your brother from the position of Duke through fraudulent means? Matthias looked directly at Caedric sitting in the gallery. Yes. I conspired to remove my brother because he is a dangerous sociopath who has spent 12 years terrorizing the Northern Territories through calculated brutality. I conspired to remove him because our father died begging me to protect the family legacy from Caedric's destructive governance. And I conspired to remove him because I genuinely believed the duchy would be better served by anyone other than a man incapable of human empathy. The gallery erupted. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. Matthias continued speaking, his voice rising above the chaos. But my brother is correct about one thing. Our father was corrupt. Every duke before him was corrupt. The Ashborne legacy is built on crimes so numerous that exposing them required 23 pages of documentation, and the only reason Caedric revealed those crimes was not honor or justice. It was revenge, because he cannot tolerate being challenged, cannot accept being questioned, cannot survive in a world where he is not the most feared man in any room he enters. He stood despite his attorney's urgent whispered objections. So yes, I committed fraud. Yes, I falsified documents. Yes, I deserve whatever sentence this court imposes. But understand what you are really doing here. You are not punishing a criminal. You are legitimizing a tyrant. And when my brother returns to Ravenscar with the Crown's blessing, remember that you had the opportunity to stop him and chose not to. Lord Justice Pembroke's gavel came down like a gunshot. Mr. Ashborne, you will sit down immediately or be removed from this courtroom. Matthias sat. But the damage was done. Every person in that gallery had just heard a condemned man call his brother a sociopath, had heard him frame the trial not as justice, but as institutional endorsement of tyranny, had heard him plant a seed of doubt that would grow in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Caedric felt Elena's hand on his arm, a silent warning to remain expressionless. But inside, something cold and familiar began spreading through his chest. Recognition. Matthias had not been trying to defend himself. He had been trying to destroy Caedric's credibility, to transform his own conviction into martyrdom, to make certain that even in defeat, His brother's victory would be tainted by the accusation of sociopathy delivered in open court and reported in every newspaper in the kingdom. The verdict came 3 hours later, guilty on all charges. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. Caedric and Elena left the courthouse through a rear entrance to avoid the mob of journalists shouting questions. They climbed into a carriage and rode through London streets in absolute silence until they reached their rented townhouse. Only then did Elena speak. That was a declaration of war, not against the crown, against you specifically. Matthias always was better at long-term strategy than I gave him credit for, Caedric replied. He knew he would be convicted, so he used his testimony to poison every victory I might claim. Now every article about the trial will mention his accusation. Every political opponent will reference it. Every noble family will whisper about whether the Duke of Ashborne is actually a dangerous sociopath ruling through fear. And are you? The question hung in the carriage like smoke. Caedric looked at Elena in the dim light filtering through the curtained windows. I do not know. I know I am capable of brutality. I know I prioritize results over relationships. I know I have destroyed men who threaten my interests without losing sleep over their suffering. But sociopathy requires absence of empathy, and I'm sitting here terrified that my brother might be right. Elena reached across the space between them and took his hand. A sociopath would not be afraid of being a sociopath. A sociopath would not have spent 3 months building a case based on honesty instead of simply having his brother quietly killed. A sociopath would not be questioning himself right now. You are telling me what I want to hear. I'm telling you what I observe. There is a difference. The carriage rolled to a stop outside their townhouse. They sat motionless for a moment, neither moving to exit. What happens now? Elena asked quietly. Now we return to Ravenscar and discover whether truth was strong enough to overcome accusation, whether honesty can survive propaganda, whether I can build something legitimate from the ruins of a corrupt legacy. He opened the carriage door, or whether Matthias was right and I am exactly the monster he described. They returned to Ravenscar Keep 4 days later to discover the Northern Territories had changed in their absence. Not obviously, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that suggested erosion more than collapse. Tenant families still worked the fields. Estate operations continued functioning. The council still met weekly to review administrative matters. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface stability. People looked at Caedric differently now. The servants who had once lowered their eyes in genuine fear now lowered them in calculated wariness. The council members who had accepted his authority out of necessity now questioned every decision with barely concealed suspicion. The Northern Guard maintained discipline, but their loyalty felt performative rather than authentic. Matthias's accusation had infected the territory like a virus no amount of truth could fully eradicate. General Blackwood met them in the main hall 3 hours after their return. We need to talk, privately. They moved to Caedric's study. Blackwood closed the door and stood with his arms crossed, his expression harder than Caedric had ever seen it. Half the officer corps is requesting transfers to other commands. The Guard is hemorrhaging experienced leadership because they do not want to serve a duke who has been publicly called a sociopath by his own brother. Matthias was convicted of fraud, Caedric replied. His testimony was the desperate accusation of a guilty man. Irrelevant. The accusation exists. It is in every newspaper. It will be in every history book written about this trial. And perception shapes reality more effectively than truth ever will. Blackwood moved to the window, staring out at the cliffs. I have served the Ashborne family for 37 years. I watched your father build this duchy through careful alliances and strategic marriages. I watched you inherit it and transform governance into something more efficient, but infinitely colder. And I watched Matthias try to steal it because he believed your methods were unsustainable. He turned back to face Caedric. Your brother was wrong about many things, but he was right about one. Fear creates compliance, not loyalty, and compliance evaporates the moment a more appealing alternative presents itself. What are you saying? I am saying that half your council is looking for opportunities to replace you, that noble families who supported your return are reconsidering their alliances, that the crown is watching Ravenscar very carefully to determine whether you are an asset or a liability, and that you have approximately 6 months to transform perception before this entire structure collapses again. And if I cannot transform perception in 6 months, then I suggest you prepare for another coup, because the next one will be better planned and far more successful. Blackwood left without waiting for dismissal. Caedric stood in the study that had belonged to his father, surrounded by books about leadership and legacy, written by men who had never been called sociopaths in open court. Elena entered silently, closing the door behind her. Blackwood is correct. The trial damaged you more than Matthias's coup ever could, because coups can be reversed through legal procedure, but accusations about your fundamental nature cannot be disproven through documentation. Then what do you recommend? Prove him wrong. Not through words, through actions. Show this territory that you are capable of governance that prioritizes their welfare instead of your control. I have been doing that for 3 months. Infrastructure projects, wage restoration, transparency reforms. You have been doing those things while maintaining absolute authority. There is a difference between generous tyranny and actual shared governance. Caedric felt something sharp twist in his chest. You want me to relinquish power? I want you to share it. Genuinely share it, not as performance, but as fundamental restructuring of how this duchy operates. That is weakness. The moment I show weakness, every ambitious rival will interpret it as opportunity. Or, Elena said quietly, they will interpret it as evolution, as a duke who is strong enough to admit his previous methods were flawed and secure enough to build something better. She moved closer. Matthias called you a sociopath. You can spend the rest of your life trying to prove you are not. Or you can build a governance structure so different from everything you have done before that the accusation becomes irrelevant. How? By making me co-duke. The words landed like artillery fire. Caedric stared at her, processing the suggestion through every possible lens of strategy and consequence. The duchy charter does not allow for co-governance. The title passes through male bloodline exclusively. Then change the charter. You control the council. You have parliamentary connections. You have the authority to propose amendments to family governance structures. Parliament will never approve a woman holding dual authority over a duchy. Parliament approved your reinstatement after you exposed 6 generations of family corruption. They will approve this because it demonstrates you are willing to transform Ashborne governance into something unprecedented, something that might actually survive the next generation without collapsing into another succession war. She held his gaze with absolute certainty. Make me co-duke. Give me legal authority equal to yours. Show this kingdom that you trust another human being enough to share power, and watch every accusation of sociopathy evaporate because sociopaths do not voluntarily divide authority with anyone. Caedric walked to the window, watching storm clouds gather over the northern sea. If I do this, if I make you co-duke, you will have the legal right to overrule my decisions, to block initiatives I consider essential, to potentially remove me from governance if you determine I'm acting against duchy interests. Yes, that is strategic suicide. That is partnership, Elena corrected. Real partnership. Not the version where I advise and you decide. Actual structural equality where neither of us can act without the other's agreement. And if we disagree? If we reach a point where your priorities conflict with mine, then we negotiate. We compromise. We find solutions that serve both our perspectives, like functional adults instead of dictators terrified of appearing weak. Caedric turned from the window to face her. This is not about proving Matthias wrong. This is about you genuinely believing I need to change. Yes, I believe you need to change, not because you are a sociopath, but because the world is changing and rulers who refuse to adapt eventually get replaced by people willing to evolve. She crossed the space between them. 3 months ago, you stood in mud outside your own fortress because you ruled through fear alone. You survived because you learned to build alliances instead of demanding obedience. Now you are facing another crisis, another opportunity to evolve or repeat the same patterns that led to your first exile. What if I am incapable of sharing power? What if my brother was right, and I am fundamentally broken in ways that make genuine partnership impossible? Then we discover that together, Elena said. And if it is true, if you genuinely cannot function in a system where you are not in absolute control, then I walk away and you face whatever comes next alone. But I do not believe that is true. I believe you are capable of transformation. I believe you can build something that lasts, but only if you are willing to stop being afraid of your own capacity for change. The storm broke over Ravenscar with sudden violence, rain hammering against the windows hard enough to rattle glass in its frames. Caedric studied Elena's face, searching for doubt or manipulation or any sign that this was strategic positioning rather than genuine conviction. He found none. "I will propose the charter amendment," he said quietly, "but understand what you are asking. You will be tied to me permanently. Every decision I make will reflect on you. Every failure will be your failure. Every scandal will be your scandal. You are asking to share authority with a man the entire kingdom believes might be a dangerous sociopath. I am asking to share authority with a man who is brave enough to question whether he might be a monster. That is not sociopathy. That is conscience." She reached up and touched his face. "So yes, I understand what I am asking, and I am asking anyway." 6 weeks later, Caedric presented the charter amendment to the Ashborne Council. The proposal was simple in structure and revolutionary in execution. Elena Hartwell would be granted the title of co-duke with legal authority equal to Caedric's own. All major decisions would require approval from both parties. Estate finances would be jointly managed. Governance would be restructured from autocracy into genuine partnership. The council reacted exactly as Caedric predicted, with outrage so profound it bordered on physical violence. Lord Pemberton stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. "This is absurd. You cannot grant dual authority to a woman with no bloodline connection to the Ashborne family. The charter exists specifically to prevent this kind of unprecedented corruption of tradition." "Tradition is another word for patterns we are too afraid to change," Caedric replied. "The charter was written 300 years ago by men who believed governance required absolute authority concentrated in a single bloodline. Those men were wrong. 6 generations of Ashborne dukes proved them wrong through corruption, tyranny, and eventual collapse." He stood, placing both hands on the council table. "I am proposing we build something different, something that survives because it is based on shared accountability rather than individual control. And if that threatens your sense of tradition, then I suggest you find employment with a duchy more interested in preserving the past than building the future." Viscount Halford spoke up, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. "And what happens when you and the co-duke disagree? When decision-making becomes paralyzed by conflicting priorities? Then we negotiate. We compromise. We demonstrate that effective governance is possible without one person holding absolute power." Lord Ames leaned forward. "This is about the trial, about Matthias's accusation. You're trying to prove you are not a sociopath by creating a governance structure that forces you to cooperate with another human being." Caedric met his eyes without blinking. "Yes, that is exactly what I am doing, and if that offends your sensibilities, you are welcome to resign." The room fell silent. Elena spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "Gentlemen, you have 2 options. Support this amendment and participate in building a duchy that might actually survive the next succession. Or oppose it and watch Duke Caedric rule exactly as he did before, with the same brutal efficiency that led to the coup you participated in 6 months ago." She paused. "I am offering you a third path. A system where power is distributed instead of concentrated, where accountability exists because neither duke can act without the other's agreement. You can call it unprecedented, you can call it corruption of tradition, but what you cannot call it is the same failed system that has dominated Ashborne governance for 300 years. Lord Pemberton's face had gone from red to purple. "And if we refuse to support this amendment?" "Then you resign," Caedric said flatly. "I am not offering a debate. I am informing you of a structural change. Your only choice is whether you participate or find employment elsewhere." The council sat in stunned silence. Then General Blackwood, who had been standing near the window observing without comment, walked to the table and placed his hand flat on the polished wood. "I support the amendment." Every head in the room turned toward him. "I have served this family for 37 years. I have watched 4 dukes govern through autocracy and witnessed 3 of them fail catastrophically. Duke Caedric is offering something unprecedented, a governance model that might actually function beyond a single generation. And I will support that model because I am more interested in sustainability than tradition." He looked directly at Lord Pemberton. "The question is whether you are capable of the same prioritization." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Viscount Halford stood. "I support the amendment." Lord Ames stood. "I support the amendment." One by one, the council members rose and voiced their support. Not enthusiastically, not willingly, but with the resignation of men who recognized they had run out of alternatives. Only Lord Pemberton remained seated. Caedric looked at him with absolute calm. "Lord Pemberton, do you support the amendment?" The elderly nobleman sat motionless, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Then he stood, placed both hands on the table, and leaned forward. "I resign, effective immediately. I will not participate in the destruction of 300 years of Ashbourne tradition to satisfy your need to prove you are not the monster your brother accurately described." He turned and walked toward the door. Caedric's voice stopped him before he reached it. "Lord Pemberton, when you leave this chamber, you leave Ashbourne territory permanently. Your estate will be confiscated, your title will be revoked, and your family will be barred from holding any position within duchy governance for 3 generations." Pemberton turned back, his expression shocked. "You cannot do that." "I can. And I will. Because I need this council to understand that opposition to structural reform is not political disagreement. It is betrayal. And betrayal has consequences so severe that every person who witnesses them remembers never to attempt it again." For the first time since Caedric had known him, Lord Pemberton looked genuinely afraid. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, calculation visible on his face. Then he returned to the table and sat down. "I support the amendment." His voice was hollow, defeated, but sufficient. Caedric looked around the chamber at 12 men who had just been given a choice between evolution and exile. "Good. Then we vote. All in favor of granting Elena Hartwell the title of co-duke with full legal authority equal to my own?" 12 hands rose. "The amendment is approved. Miss Hartwell will be formally installed as co-duke in a ceremony next week." Council dismissed. They filed out in silence, leaving only Caedric, Elena, and Blackwood in the chamber. The general poured himself whiskey from the crystal decanter. "That was the most terrifying display of controlled brutality I have witnessed in 37 years of military service." Caedric did not respond. Elena moved to stand beside him. "You threatened to destroy Pemberton's entire family legacy." "I made a promise," Caedric corrected. "There is a difference." She studied his face. "You are still afraid you might be what Matthias said. Every day, every decision, every moment I feel the urge to crush opposition through pure intimidation. I wonder whether my brother identified something I cannot fix." "Then prove him wrong," Elena said quietly. "Not through grand gestures, through small choices, through the accumulated weight of decisions that prioritize their welfare over your control." She took his hand, starting with genuinely sharing power, not as performance, but as fundamental transformation of who you are. Caedric looked down at their joined hands. "I am trusting you with the ability to destroy everything I have rebuilt. I know. And you are trusting me not to become the tyrant Matthias described." "Yes." Outside, thunder rolled across the cliffs like artillery fire. And in that moment, standing in a council chamber where he had just threatened a man's entire legacy to force compliance, Caedric Ashborne confronted the truth he had been avoiding since the trial ended. His brother had not been entirely wrong. There was something broken inside him, something that reached for domination instead of cooperation. Something that saw shared power as weakness instead of strength. But broken things could be rebuilt, and rebuilding required the courage to let someone else hold the blueprints. The installation ceremony took place 1 week later in the Great Hall of Ravenscar Keep, before an audience of northern nobility, parliamentary observers, and enough journalists to fill 3 rows of seating. Elena stood beside Caedric wearing midnight blue silk, her expression composed, her hands steady as the Lord Chancellor administered the oath. "Do you, Elena Hartwell, swear to govern the Ashbourne territories with wisdom, justice, and dedication to the welfare of all people under your authority?" "I do." "Do you swear to share governance equally with Duke Caedric Ashborne, neither superseding his authority nor deferring to it, but ruling as genuine partners in all matters of duchy administration?" "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me by the Crown and Parliament, I declare you co-Duke of Ashborne with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities inherent to that title." He placed the ducal coronet on her head. The audience erupted into applause that sounded less like celebration and more like shocked disbelief that this was actually happening. Caedric watched Elena accept the title with the same controlled precision she brought to every political maneuver. No tears, no visible emotion. Just the calm certainty of someone who had calculated every variable and accepted every consequence. When the ceremony concluded, they stood together on the eastern balcony overlooking the cliffs while rain moved across the sea in gray curtains. "How does it feel?" Caedric asked. "Terrifying," Elena admitted. "I have authority to overrule you, to block initiatives you consider essential, to potentially destroy everything we have built if I make the wrong decision." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "I need you to promise me something. Name it. If I ever become what you were before the coup, if I ever start prioritizing control over welfare, if I ever transform into the kind of ruler who governs through fear instead of partnership, I need you to remove me. Immediately. Without hesitation." Caedric studied her face. "That is asking me to destroy the only person I trust. That is asking you to value the duchy more than your own comfort, which is exactly what I am asking you to do every single day." She turned back toward the sea. "We are building something unprecedented, something that will either transform how power functions in this kingdom or collapse spectacularly and prove that autocracy is the only sustainable governance model. And I need to know you are committed to the first outcome, even if it costs you everything." The rain intensified until the cliffs disappeared into silver static. Caedric reached out and took her hand. "I promise." "Then we begin." But as they stood together on that balcony, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line half a mile distant. A man wearing a traveling cloak, a man who should have been in prison awaiting sentencing, a man whose trial had concluded with a guilty verdict and 15-year sentence, Matthias Ashborne. And in his hand he carried a letter bearing the seal of Lord Chancellor Grenville. The assassin entered Ravenscar Keep through the servants' entrance at 3 a.m, dressed in household livery stolen from a laundry cart, carrying a pistol with 6 rounds and instructions written in Lord Chancellor Grenville's own hand. His target was not the Duke. Killing Caedric would create a martyr and trigger investigations that Grenville could not afford. The target was the woman who had just been crowned co-Duke before half the kingdom, Elena Hartwell, the orphan nobody who had somehow convinced a dangerous man to share power. Remove her, and Caedric would revert to the isolated tyrant everyone expected. Remove her, and the unprecedented governance experiment would collapse before it threatened the entire parliamentary power structure. The assassin made it as far as the third-floor corridor before Captain Thorne put a blade through his throat. The body hit the stone floor with a wet sound that echoed down the hallway. Thorne wiped his knife clean and immediately sent runners to wake both dukes. Caedric reached the corridor first, wearing only trousers and a shirt thrown on without bothering with buttons. He stared down at the corpse leaking blood across expensive carpet. "Search him." Thorne knelt and extracted a folded letter from inside the dead man's coat. The seal had already been broken. Caedric took it and read by lamplight while his pulse hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that felt like distant artillery. The letter was brief, professional, and signed by Grenville himself. "Eliminate the co-governance structure by any means necessary. Payment upon confirmation of success." Elena arrived 30 seconds later, her expression shifting from confusion to cold fury as she processed the scene. "Grenville sent an assassin." "Not just an assassin," Caedric replied. "A message. He is telling us that Parliament will not tolerate structural reform. That shared governance threatens the entire aristocratic system. That we either revert to traditional autocracy or face elimination." He handed her the letter. She read it once, twice, then looked up with eyes that had gone flat and merciless. "We ride for London at dawn. We confront Grenville directly, and we make certain he understands that attempting to murder a duke carries consequences severe enough to end political careers permanently." "No," Caedric said quietly. Elena stared at him. "No? If we ride for London, we leave Ravenscar vulnerable. Grenville is not working alone. This was coordinated, which means there are other players we have not identified yet. Other threats we have not neutralized. Then we send the guard. We have Grenville arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. On what evidence? A letter that could be forged. An assassin who is conveniently dead and cannot testify. Grenville will deny everything, claim the letter is fabricated by enemies trying to undermine him, and turn our accusation into proof that we are paranoid autocrats seeing conspiracies everywhere. Caedric moved to the window overlooking the cliffs where dawn was beginning to stain the eastern sky with bands of copper and gray. No, we do not react. We do not give him the satisfaction of watching us panic. We investigate. We identify everyone involved in this conspiracy, and then we dismantle them so completely that future generations use their destruction as a cautionary tale about challenging Ashborne authority. Captain Thorne cleared his throat. Your Grace, there is something else. We found this in the assassin's other pocket. He held out a second document. A banking receipt showing a deposit of £5,000 into an account registered to someone named Marcus Webb. The transaction was dated 3 days ago. The depositing institution was a London bank known for handling aristocratic finances. Caedric took the receipt and studied it with the methodical focus of a general analyzing enemy troop movements. Marcus Webb. Any relation to Harrison Webb? Harrison Webb's younger brother, Thorne confirmed, the lawyer who defended Matthias during the trial. The pieces assembled in Caedric's mind with brutal clarity. Matthias. He orchestrated this from prison, somehow convinced Grenville that Elena represented a threat significant enough to warrant assassination. Used his lawyer's family connections to arrange payment, and timed it to occur exactly 1 week after the Co-Duke installation, when security would be focused on external threats instead of internal infiltration. That is impossible, Elena said. Matthias is in an Edinburgh cell awaiting transfer to a long-term facility. He has no access to outside communications, unless someone with parliamentary authority granted him that access. The implications hung in the air like cordite smoke. Grenville did not just send an assassin, Caedric continued. He is actively coordinating with my brother to destabilize Ashborne governance, which means this is not a single conspiracy. This is a comprehensive campaign to remove both of us and install someone more controllable in our place. Who? The only person with legitimate bloodline claim besides Matthias and me. Our cousin, Lord Sebastian Ashborne. Elena's expression went very still. The same Sebastian who currently sits on the Parliamentary Finance Committee. The same Sebastian who has spent the last 6 months quietly building alliances with noble families who opposed your reinstatement. Yes. She moved to stand beside him at the window. This is bigger than Grenville, bigger than Matthias. They are trying to execute a complete regime change using legal mechanisms, political pressure, and when those failed, assassination. Caedric watched the sun rise over cliffs that had witnessed 6 generations of Ashborne dukes fight for survival against enemies both external and internal. Then we give them what they want. Elena turned to stare at him. What? We let them think the assassination succeeded. We spread word that you were killed. We stage a funeral. We watch Sebastian and Grenville and every conspirator reveal themselves through their reaction to your death. And when we have identified everyone involved, we destroy them simultaneously. That is insane. That is strategic. Right now we know about Grenville and Matthias and Sebastian, but we do not know who else is involved, how deep this conspiracy extends, which council members are compromised, which parliamentary allies have been turned. We need to make them think they won, so they expose themselves fully. And if something goes wrong, if the deception fails, then we improvise, Caedric said flatly. But doing nothing is not an option. Neither is reacting predictably. So we do the one thing they will never expect. We play dead and watch them fight over the corpse. Elena held his gaze for a long moment. This will require me to disappear completely, to hide while you govern alone, to trust that you will not revert to autocracy the moment I am not physically present to hold you accountable. I know, and you're asking me to do it anyway. I am asking you to trust me, completely, the way I trusted you when I made you co-duke. She looked back at the dead assassin bleeding across expensive carpet. How long? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. long enough for the conspirators to believe they succeeded and start consolidating power. Then we reveal you are alive and execute everyone involved before they can organize a defense. And if you become the tyrant Matthias described during those 3 weeks, then you remove me exactly as you promised. Elena walked to where Captain Thorne stood waiting for orders. Make the body disappear, completely. No grave, no burial. Nothing that can be exhumed for verification. Then spread word through the household staff that I was killed by an assassin. Make it convincing, make it tragic, make certain every servant believes it absolutely. Thorne nodded once and began issuing commands to the guards standing watch in the corridor. Caedric moved to Elena and pulled her close enough that his next words were barely audible. When this is over, when we have crushed every person who tried to destroy what we built, I need you to promise me something. What? That you will tell me if I have become someone you can no longer recognize. That you will walk away if I cross a line you cannot accept. Because the most dangerous thing about power is not wanting it. It is convincing yourself that brutality in service of good outcomes is somehow different than brutality in service of control. Elena reached up and touched his face. I promise. But you need to promise me something in return. Name it. That you will remember this moment, when you stood in a corridor with a dead assassin and chose strategy over rage. When you prioritized intelligence over immediate retaliation. When you demonstrated that you are capable of patience even when every instinct demands violence. I promise. They stood together for one more moment before Elena turned and disappeared into the pre-dawn shadows, becoming a ghost inside her own fortress. The funeral took place 3 days later under rain so heavy it turned the cemetery into churning mud. Caedric stood beside an empty coffin, surrounded by council members, household staff, and enough northern nobility to fill half the graveyard. He wore black that looked like it had been painted directly onto his body. His expression was carved from granite. His voice when he spoke the eulogy was absolutely empty. Elena Hartwell gave her life protecting this duchy from forces that would see it destroyed. She understood that power without sacrifice is just performance, that governance without risk is just administration, that leadership means standing between your people and everything that threatens them, even when that threat comes dressed in parliamentary authority. He paused, letting rain hammer against the coffin. She was my partner, my conscience, my reminder that strength and brutality are not the same thing, and her death will be answered with justice so absolute that future generations will remember the cost of attempting to murder an Ashborne duke. The crowd stood in absolute silence. And in London, in a private club where aristocrats gathered to discuss politics over brandy and cigars, Lord Chancellor Grenville received the news with carefully concealed satisfaction. Across the room, Lord Sebastian Ashborne raised his glass in a toast that everyone pretended was about something other than celebration. In Edinburgh, in a prison cell that somehow had access to newspapers dated the same day, Matthias Ashborne read the obituary and smiled for the first time in 6 months. They had no idea what was coming. Elena spent 17 days in a hunting cottage 12 miles from Ravenscar, living under a false name with 2 guards Caedric trusted absolutely. She used the time to read every letter intercepted from suspicious correspondence, review every financial transaction flagged by the estate auditors, and map the conspiracy with the methodical precision of a general planning a siege. The network was extensive, terrifying in its scope. Grenville had recruited 8 parliamentary members. Sebastian had secured commitments from 5 noble families. Matthias had provided intelligence on Ashborne security protocols from inside his cell. And beneath all of them, funding the entire operation, was a banking consortium that stood to profit enormously from destabilizing northern trade routes controlled by Ashborne shipping monopolies. It was not personal. It was economic. They were trying to destroy her and Caedric because the co-governance model threatened to demonstrate that autocratic control was unnecessary for effective administration. And if that demonstration succeeded, every duchy in the kingdom would face pressure to reform. Every aristocratic power structure would be questioned. Every lord who ruled through fear and intimidation would be forced to justify his methods. She wrote everything down in documentation so detailed it would take prosecutors years to fully process. Then she waited. Meanwhile, Caedric governed alone for the first time in 3 months. The transformation was subtle at first. Small decisions that prioritized efficiency over consensus. Council meetings that felt more like briefings than discussions. Administrative reforms implemented without consultation. General Blackwood noticed first. On the 9th day of Elena's disappearance, he found Caedric in the study reviewing shipping manifests at midnight. "You are reverting." Caedric did not look up from the documents. "I am governing. You are consolidating, making unilateral decisions, overriding council recommendations without explanation." The same patterns that led to the first coup. Those patterns were effective. They were unsustainable, Blackwood corrected. "You are proving Matthias right. The moment Elena was removed, you returned to autocracy like a soldier reverting to training under stress." Caedric finally looked up, his eyes carrying a flatness that made Blackwood's hand drift toward his sidearm unconsciously. "I am doing what is necessary to protect this duchy while Elena is absent. When she returns, governance will resume as partnership. Until then, I make decisions that keep us alive. And if she does not return, she will." "You sound very certain of that." "I am certain of very little, General, but I am certain that Elena Hartwell is too intelligent to stay dead when resurrection serves her interests better than martyrdom." Blackwood studied the Duke's face, searching for the man who had stood on that balcony 17 days ago, promising to share power. He found someone else entirely. On the 14th day, Lord Sebastian Ashborne arrived at Ravenscar Keep with a formal petition signed by 12 parliamentary members requesting an emergency review of duchy governance practices. Caedric received him in the Great Hall, seated in the ducal chair that had belonged to his father, with Captain Thorne standing to his right and General Blackwood to his left. Sebastian was 42 years old, handsome in the way aristocrats achieved through selective breeding, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed birthright mattered more than competence. He approached the ducal chair with a smile that was probably meant to seem sympathetic, but landed closer to triumphant. "Cousin, my deepest condolences on your loss. Elena was a remarkable woman." Caedric said nothing. Sebastian's smile flickered slightly. "I come bearing a petition from Parliament. Given the tragic circumstances and the experimental nature of the co-governance structure, there is concern about administrative stability. The petition requests a formal review to determine whether traditional succession protocols should be reinstated." He placed a leather folder on the small table beside the ducal chair. "Of course, no one questions your authority, but there is precedent for parliamentary oversight during periods of transition, particularly when governance models are untested and potentially unstable." Caedric picked up the folder and read the petition with deliberate slowness. It was exactly what Elena had predicted. A carefully worded legal document that would strip him of autonomous authority and place Ashborne governance under parliamentary supervision, which would allow Sebastian and his allies to systematically dismantle everything Caedric and Elena had built while maintaining the appearance of legitimate procedure. He set the folder down. "You coordinated with Grenville to have my co-duke assassinated, so you could present this petition as a reasonable response to administrative uncertainty." Sebastian's face went pale. "That is a serious accusation. It is a statement of fact. You believed removing Elena would make me vulnerable. You believed I would revert to isolated autocracy and Parliament could justify intervention. You believed wrong." "I have no idea what you are talking about." Caedric stood. "You worked with Lord Chancellor Grenville and my brother Matthias to orchestrate an assassination attempt on a sitting duke. You provided intelligence on Ravenscar security protocols. You secured funding through the Montrose Banking Consortium, and you drafted this petition 3 weeks before the assassination attempt, which suggests you knew Elena would be dead and prepared documentation accordingly." Sebastian took a step backward. "You cannot prove any of that." "No," Caedric agreed. "But she can." Elena stepped out from behind a tapestry near the eastern wall, alive and carrying a leather portfolio thick with documentation. Sebastian's face went from pale to gray. "You are supposed to be dead." "I was," Elena said calmly. "It was tremendously inconvenient, but I'm feeling much better now." She walked forward and placed the portfolio on the table beside the petition. "Inside you will find banking records connecting you to the Montrose Consortium. Correspondence between you and Grenville discussing optimal timing for administrative intervention. and a rather incriminating letter from Matthias outlining security vulnerabilities at Ravenscar that you subsequently used to plan the assassination attempt. Sebastian looked between Caedric and Elena with an expression approaching genuine panic. This is entrapment. You cannot use evidence gathered through deception. We can use evidence gathered through investigation, Caedric replied, which is what this was. A comprehensive investigation into a conspiracy to commit murder and political coup. The deception was simply the mechanism that allowed conspirators to reveal themselves fully. He gestured to Captain Thorne. Arrest Lord Sebastian Ashborne on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, treason, and corruption of parliamentary process. He will be held in Ravenscar's detention facility pending transfer to Crown custody. Thorne moved forward with 2 guards. Sebastian backed against the wall. You cannot do this. I am a member of Parliament. I have immunity from arrest by Duchy authority. You had immunity, Elena corrected. That immunity was revoked 6 hours ago when we presented our evidence to the Crown prosecutor, who was very interested to learn that a sitting member of Parliament had coordinated an assassination attempt on a duke. The guard seized Sebastian and bound his wrists. He looked at Caedric with pure hatred. You think you have won, but there are 8 other parliamentary members involved in this. Families with enough wealth and influence to destroy you through legal warfare. You just started a war you cannot possibly win. Then we will lose spectacularly, Caedric said, but we will take every conspirator down with us. And when the smoke clears, Parliament will understand that attempting to murder Ashborne authority results in consequences so severe that future generations tell stories about the bodies. Sebastian was dragged from the hall, still screaming threats that echoed off stone walls built to withstand sieges. When silence returned, Elena moved to stand beside Caedric. Grenville will respond within 24 hours, probably with a motion to strip you of ducal authority based on overreach of jurisdiction. Let him try. We have documentation proving he funded the assassination. We have testimony from the Webb family connecting him to the conspiracy. And we have Crown support because the prosecutor understands that allowing parliamentary members to murder dukes creates a precedent that threatens the entire aristocratic system. She studied his face. You enjoyed that. Watching Sebastian realize he was caught. Watching him panic. I enjoyed justice, Caedric corrected. Did you? He turned to face her fully. What are you asking? I am asking if you became the person Matthias described while I was gone. If you reverted to autocracy, if you forgot the promises you made about shared governance. Caedric walked to the window overlooking the cliffs where morning light was beginning to burn through fog. I made 17 major decisions in the time you were gone. 12 of them I would have consulted you on under normal circumstances. I did not consult you because you were supposed to be dead, but I documented every decision, every rationale, every alternative I considered. And when this is over, I will review all of it with you and accept your judgment on whether I crossed lines that should not have been crossed. He looked back at her. Did I enjoy the authority? Yes. Did I feel the pull toward isolated control? Absolutely. But I also felt the absence of your perspective, the lack of someone holding me accountable, the danger of making decisions that served my anger instead of duchy interests. And I am asking you to review those 17 decisions and tell me honestly whether I became someone you can no longer partner with. Elena crossed the hall to stand beside him. I will review them, and I will tell you honestly. But Caedric, you need to understand something. The fact that you are asking means you have not become what Matthias described. Sociopaths do not question themselves. Tyrants do not document their decisions for oversight. Autocrats do not voluntarily submit to accountability. Then what am I? Someone learning to share power, imperfectly, struggling with instincts toward control, but learning. She took his hand, which is exactly what I'm doing, learning to trust that you will not become a monster the moment I am not watching, learning to believe that partnership is sustainable even when tested by assassination and conspiracy. Outside, rain began to fall across the northern territories, washing blood from courtyard stones and carrying away the evidence of violence that had nearly destroyed everything they built. But violence, as they both understood, was never truly finished. It simply waited for the next opportunity. That opportunity arrived 18 hours later when a messenger brought news from London. Lord Chancellor Grenville had been found dead in his townhouse. Single gunshot wound to the head, ruled a suicide by investigating authorities. A note beside the body confessed to corruption and expressed remorse for unspecified crimes against the crown. Caedric read the report twice. This was not suicide. No, Elena agreed. Someone executed him to prevent testimony. Someone with enough influence to stage a suicide, convincing enough that authorities would not investigate further. The banking consortium. Almost certainly. Grenville was a liability once we exposed the conspiracy. They eliminated him before he could implicate anyone else, which means we are still facing threats we have not identified. Yes. Caedric set down the report. How many more? How many conspirators are still hidden? How deep does this corruption extend? Deep enough that we may never fully eliminate it, Elena said quietly. But that is the nature of power. It attracts predators. And predators adapt. So we adapt faster. We build systems that expose corruption before it metastasizes. We create accountability structures that make conspiracy prohibitively expensive. And when that fails, then we fight. Again and again, until we are too old or too dead to continue. She moved to the window. But we fight together, as partners, as equals. Because the moment we start fighting separately is the moment we become vulnerable to the same tactics that nearly destroyed us. Caedric joined her at the window, watching storm clouds gather over the sea. Matthias is still in Edinburgh, still coordinating with whoever eliminated Grenville, still planning whatever final move he believes will destroy us. Then we end it. Permanently. We ride to Edinburgh. We confront him directly. And we make certain he understands that family loyalty has limits. You want to kill your own brother. I want to neutralize a threat. If that requires killing him, then yes. Elena looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. That is the decision of a duke who prioritizes survival over sentiment. But it is also the decision that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Are you prepared for that? Caedric thought about the brother who had thrown him into rain and mud. The brother who had orchestrated assassination. The brother who had called him a sociopath in open court and meant every word. Yes, I am prepared. Then we ride at dawn. They assembled a force of 20 guards, enough to guarantee security, but not so many as to appear like an invading army. General Blackwood commanded the escort. Captain Thorne rode point. Elena and Caedric traveled in a reinforced carriage that could withstand small arms fire. The journey to Edinburgh took 2 days across roads that grew progressively worse as they moved north. They arrived at the prison facility at dusk, on a day that felt like the end of something fundamental. The warden met them at the gate, nervous and deferential. Your Grace, we received no notification of your visit. Because I sent none, Caedric replied. I am here to see my brother. Immediately. The warden led them through corridors that smelled of damp stone and human misery. Matthias's cell was at the end of the eastern wing, separated from other prisoners by 50 feet of empty corridor. He sat on a narrow bed reading a book when they arrived. He looked up and smiled. Brother? And the miraculous resurrected co-duke. I was wondering when you would come. Caedric studied his brother through iron bars. You coordinated the assassination from inside the cell. You provided intelligence to Grenville and Sebastian. You helped plan the entire conspiracy. Of course I did. What else was I supposed to do? Sit here quietly while you transformed Ashborne governance into some unprecedented partnership experiment, while you proved that shared power was sustainable? Matthias stood and moved to the bars. You do not understand what you are building. Every duke in this kingdom rules through concentrated authority. Every aristocratic structure is built on the principle that one person holds absolute power. If you succeed, if your co-governance model actually works, it threatens the entire system. Every lord who rules through fear will face pressure to reform. Every tyrant will be questioned. Every dynasty built on autocracy will crumble. So you tried to kill us to preserve a broken system. I tried to kill you to preserve stability, because stability requires predictability. And your experiment is the most unpredictable thing to happen to aristocratic governance in 300 years. Elena spoke for the first time. You failed. Sebastian is arrested. Grenville is dead. The conspiracy is exposed. You have nothing left except a 15-year sentence and the knowledge that you bet everything on destroying us and lost. Matthias laughed. I did not lose. I proved exactly what I intended to prove, that Caedric is a dangerous man who will destroy anyone who threatens him, that he arrested his own cousin, that he probably had Grenville killed, that he will do anything, sacrifice anyone, brutalize any opposition to maintain power. He looked directly at Caedric. You think you are building something better, but you are just building a more sophisticated version of the same tyranny our father practiced. You just convinced a brilliant woman to participate in your autocracy and call it partnership. The words landed like physical blows. Caedric felt something cold spread through his chest, because part of him wondered if Matthias was right. Elena must have sensed it because she stepped forward. You are wrong about him. He is capable of brutality, but he is also capable of restraint, of consultation, of admitting when he is wrong. I have seen him change in ways you refuse to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require admitting you misjudged him. Did I? Matthias replied. Then explain why you are here, why you traveled 2 days to confront a convicted prisoner who has no power and no influence. What do you hope to accomplish? Justice, Caedric said quietly. No, Matthias corrected. Revenge. You want me to suffer the way you suffered, to feel powerless the way you felt powerless, to understand what it means to lose everything. He smiled. But I already lost everything. You saw to that. So whatever justice you think you are delivering, I am already experiencing it. Then what do you want? Elena demanded. Matthias looked between them. I want you to fail. I want your partnership to collapse under the weight of competing priorities. I want you to realize that shared governance only works when interests align and falls apart the moment you face genuine conflict. And I want to watch it happen from inside this cell, knowing that I predicted it exactly. The corridor fell silent except for distant sounds of prisoners and guards moving through stone passages. Caedric turned to leave. Matthias called after him. One more thing, brother. There is a reason Grenville died. And it was not the banking consortium. Caedric stopped. Who killed him? Matthias smiled. Someone who understands that your experiment cannot be allowed to succeed. Someone with resources that make Grenville look like a provincial amateur. Someone who is watching Ravenscar very carefully and waiting for the exact moment when you show weakness. Who? You will find out soon enough. And when you do, you will realize that everything you have faced so far was preparation. Training. The real war has not even started yet. He returned to his bed and picked up his book. Enjoy your partnership while it lasts, because what is coming will test it in ways you cannot possibly prepare for. Caedric, Elena, and their escort left the prison as night fell across Edinburgh. They rode back toward Ravenscar in silence, each processing what Matthias had said. Halfway through the journey, Elena finally spoke. He is trying to get inside your head, to make you paranoid, to poison the partnership by suggesting threats we cannot see. I know, but you believe him anyway. Caedric looked out the carriage window at darkness flowing past. I believe someone killed Grenville. I believe that someone has resources we have not identified, and I believe Matthias is correct that everything we have faced so far was smaller than what is coming. Then we prepare. How do you prepare for an enemy you cannot identify? Elena took his hand, the same way we have prepared for everything else. Together, by trusting each other completely, by refusing to let paranoia divide us, by remembering that the strongest weapon we have is not military force or political influence, it is partnership. They reached Ravenscar 3 days later to find the estate functioning normally. Council meetings proceeding as scheduled. Northern Guard maintaining patrols, tenant families working fields. Everything appeared stable, which was exactly when the letter arrived. It was delivered by private courier to Caedric's study at midnight. No return address, no identifying marks, just expensive paper and handwriting that suggested wealth and education. Caedric opened it while Elena watched. The message was brief. Congratulations on surviving the conspiracy. Grenville was always weak. Sebastian was predictable. Your brother was useful, but limited. They failed because they underestimated you. I will not make the same mistake. Expect me when the roses bloom. We have much to discuss about the future of your experiment. Signed, a friend. Caedric read it 3 times, then handed it to Elena. She studied the message with an expression that shifted from confusion to recognition to something approaching fear. The handwriting. I have seen this before. Where? In correspondence seized from your father's private archives. Letters discussing offshore accounts and smuggling operations. Letters I did not include in the documentation we gave the Crown Prosecutor because I could not identify the sender and assumed they were old intelligence from deceased contacts. She looked up. Whoever wrote this was working with your father, has been involved in Ashborne operations for decades, and apparently decided that your governance reforms threatened their interests enough to warrant direct intervention. Caedric moved to the window overlooking cliffs where waves crashed against rocks in patterns unchanged for millennia. When the roses bloom. That is 6 weeks from now. 6 weeks to prepare for an enemy we cannot identify. An enemy with resources that dwarf everything we have faced. An enemy who has been embedded in Ashborne operations since before you were born. Caedric felt the weight of it settle across his shoulders like armor. Then we spend 6 weeks building defenses, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing for every possible attack vector. And when this mysterious friend arrives, we demonstrate exactly why threatening Ashborne authority was the last mistake they will ever make. Elena stood beside him, her reflection ghostly in rain-streaked glass. Partnership? Always. They stood together watching darkness gather over the northern territories. Somewhere in that darkness, an enemy was planning, calculating, preparing to test whether love and power could coexist, or whether one would inevitably destroy the other. And in 6 weeks, they would discover the answer. The roses bloomed early that year, their crimson petals unfurling across Ravenscar's eastern gardens like blood spilled on snow. Caedric stood at the study window, counting them with the methodical precision of a general tallying enemy forces. 43 days had passed since the letter arrived. 43 days of fortifying defenses, investigating historical records, and preparing for an enemy whose identity remained hidden behind decades of carefully constructed anonymity. Elena entered the study carrying a leather folder thick with documentation. We found something. In the archives your grandfather sealed before he died. Correspondence with someone identified only as the architect, financial records showing payments for services rendered over 30 years, and a final letter dated 6 months before your father's death. She placed the folder on the desk. Caedric opened it and read by lamplight while morning broke across cliffs that had witnessed more Ashborne blood than any battlefield in the kingdom's history. The final letter was brief and coldly transactional. Your son is too volatile for sustainable governance. When the time comes, I will ensure succession passes to someone more manageable. Consider this a courtesy for decades of profitable partnership. The signature was a single initial. V. Caedric read it twice, feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of every event that had shaped his life. My grandfather knew I would be removed. He arranged it before he died. Worked with this architect to ensure I would eventually be replaced by someone who would maintain whatever corrupt system they had built together. Not replaced, Elena corrected quietly. Controlled. Your grandfather believed you were too dangerous to rule without external oversight, so he established a failsafe. Someone with enough embedded influence to remove you if you became too unpredictable. And Matthias was their first attempt. Yes. When that failed, they eliminated Grenville to prevent him from exposing the larger network. Now they are coming directly because you survived everything they threw at you and transformed Ashborne governance into something they can no longer control through traditional mechanisms. Who is V? Elena pulled another document from the folder. A shipping manifest from 32 years ago showing cargo transfers between Ashborne vessels and a merchant fleet owned by the Vexley Trading Company. Beneath that, a marriage certificate joining Caedric's grandfather to his second wife, a woman named Victoria Vexley, your step-grandmother, the woman your grandfather married 6 months after your grandmother died, the woman who disappeared from family records after your father inherited the duchy. Caedric stared at the marriage certificate with the kind of focus that precedes violence or revelation. She was written out of the family history. I never knew she existed. Because your father discovered she had been manipulating estate operations for personal profit. He tried to remove her. She disappeared, and apparently spent the next 3 decades building a network powerful enough to destroy anyone who threatened her interests. So this is not about governance reform. This is about a woman who believes she owns Ashborne operations and is reclaiming what she considers stolen property. Elena nodded. Victoria Vexley, 73 years old, controls the largest private trading network in the Northern Territories through shell companies and offshore holdings, worth approximately £40 million, and apparently very interested in ensuring Ashborne remains profitable for her operations regardless of who holds the ducal title. Where is she now? Unknown. But she will be here today. The roses have bloomed. As if summoned by prophecy, Captain Thorne entered the study. Your Grace, there is a carriage approaching from the southern road. No escort, single passenger. The driver says she has an appointment. Caedric and Elena exchanged glances. Bring her to the Great Hall. Full security presence, armed guards at every entrance, and make certain General Blackwood is positioned with a clear line of sight. Thorne departed. Elena moved to stand beside Caedric. Whatever happens in that hall, we face it together. Equal authority, equal risk. Always. They descended to the great hall where morning light streamed through high windows onto stone floors that had absorbed centuries of Ashborne power struggles. Guards lined the walls. Blackwood stood near the eastern door with a pistol visible on his belt. The ducal chairs had been positioned side by side, a deliberate statement of co-governance that would either demonstrate strength or provide a target. The doors opened. Victoria Vexley entered with the kind of presence that made age irrelevant. She was tall, silver-haired, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than most estates generated in a year. Her face carried the sharp beauty of someone who had been stunning in youth and transformed that beauty into something more dangerous over decades of strategic manipulation. She walked directly to the center of the hall and stopped 10 feet from the ducal chairs. Her voice when she spoke was cultured, precise, and absolutely devoid of warmth. Duke Caedric, Co-Duke Elena, thank you for receiving me. I understand you have questions about my involvement in recent events. Caedric remained seated, forcing her to address him from a position of physical disadvantage. You orchestrated a conspiracy to remove me from governance. You funded Matthias's coup. You had Grenville killed when he became a liability, and you believe you have the authority to determine who rules Ashborne territory. Victoria smiled. I have more than authority. I have investment. Your grandfather and I built the financial infrastructure that transformed Ashborne from a provincial duchy into one of the wealthiest territories in the kingdom. We established shipping monopolies, offshore accounts, and trade networks that generate millions in annual revenue that flows through companies I control. She moved closer. When your grandfather died, your father tried to sever those connections, tried to clean up operations and run the duchy through legitimate channels. It cost him half the estate's income and nearly bankrupted Ashborne before he died. You inherited that financial disaster and rebuilt it through brutality and fear, which worked. But brutality is expensive. It creates enemies. It generates instability. And you believe shared governance is more stable? I believe shared governance is a performance, a temporary experiment that will collapse the moment you face genuine conflict of interest. And when it collapses, I will ensure succession passes to someone who understands that Ashborne exists to generate profit, not test political theories. Elena stood. You are describing Ashborne as if it is a business you own instead of a duchy with responsibility to people who live and work these territories. It is a business I own, Victoria replied. Legally, through shell corporations. Financially, through investments your grandfather granted me in exchange for services rendered. And practically through networks so embedded in estate operations that removing them would collapse the entire economic structure. She pulled a document from inside her coat. This is a contract signed by your grandfather, granting me perpetual partnership in Ashborne commercial operations. It survives succession. It cannot be revoked without mutual consent. And it gives me legal authority to challenge any governance decision that threatens my financial interests. Caedric took the contract and read it with growing fury. It was legitimate, notarized, binding. My grandfather sold you a permanent stake in Ashborne. He granted me partnership in exchange for building the infrastructure that saved this duchy from irrelevance. And I am here to inform you that your co-governance experiment threatens that infrastructure. Shared authority creates administrative delays. Consultation requirements slow decision-making. Partnership introduces emotional considerations that compromise profit maximization. So you want us to dissolve the co-governance structure and return to autocracy. I want you to acknowledge reality. Power cannot be shared without diminishing both parties. Your partnership will fail. And when it does, I will be here to ensure Ashborne continues generating revenue, regardless of your personal relationship drama. Caedric felt Elena's hand on his arm. A warning. A reminder of every conversation about restraint and strategic patience. But restraint had limits. He stood and walked down from the ducal platform until he was standing directly in front of Victoria. You believe you own Ashborne because my grandfather was desperate enough to sell you influence. You believe profit matters more than people. You believe power is measured in wealth and contracts. You are wrong about all of it. He gestured to the guards lining the walls. These men do not serve me because I pay them. They serve because I restructured wages to reflect actual value, because I ended corruption that diverted their salaries to council members, because I demonstrated that governance can prioritize their welfare without sacrificing efficiency. He turned to look at Elena. And I share power not because it is easy or comfortable, but because I learned that isolated authority makes you vulnerable to people like you. People who accumulate influence through exploitation and call it partnership. Victoria's expression did not change. Idealism is charming in young dukes, but it does not pay soldiers. It does not maintain infrastructure. It does not compete with merchant networks that will crush you the moment you show weakness. Then let them try, Elena said, moving to stand beside Caedric. Because we have something you will never understand. We have loyalty earned through transformation instead of fear. We have alliances built on mutual interest instead of blackmail. And we have a governance structure that survives precisely because it does not depend on one person holding absolute power. Victoria studied them both with the clinical assessment of someone calculating vulnerabilities. You are in love. How inconvenient. Love makes you predictable, makes you prioritize each other over strategic necessity, makes you weak. Caedric felt something cold settle in his chest. You're wrong. Love makes us dangerous, because we fight for something larger than self-interest. We fight for a partnership that threatens every corrupt system you have spent decades building. Then you will lose, Victoria said simply, because I have resources you cannot match, political connections that extend to the crown itself, and the patience to wait for your inevitable collapse before I move to install someone more cooperative. She turned to leave. Caedric's voice stopped her. You are not leaving Ravenscar. Victoria looked back, surprised for the first time. You cannot detain me. I have committed no crime you can prove. You orchestrated Grenville's murder. You funded a conspiracy to commit assassination. And you just admitted to holding an illegal partnership in duchy operations that violates territorial governance law. Victoria smiled. Prove any of it. The contract is legal. My business dealings are conducted through legitimate corporations. And Grenville's death was ruled a suicide by Crown investigators. Caedric walked back to the ducal platform and picked up a folder Elena had placed there earlier. We cannot prove you killed Grenville, but we can prove you have been diverting Ashborne commercial revenue through fraudulent accounting for 32 years. We can prove you established shell companies to hide taxable income. And we can prove you use duchy resources for private profit without authorization. He handed the folder to Captain Thorne. Arrest Victoria Vexley on charges of commercial fraud, tax evasion, and corruption of duchy operations. She will be held pending investigation and trial. Victoria's composure finally cracked. You cannot do this. I am not subject to duchy authority. You became subject to duchy authority the moment you signed a partnership contract with my grandfather. That contract makes you legally accountable to Ashborne governance for any commercial activities conducted under duchy jurisdiction. Guards moved forward. Victoria did not resist. But her eyes, when she looked at Caedric, carried the flat hatred of someone who had just been outmaneuvered by an opponent she had underestimated. This is not over. I have allies who will destroy you for this. Then they can try, Caedric replied. But they should understand something first. Every person who has tried to destroy Ashborne authority in the last year is either dead, imprisoned, or ruined. Your allies can join that list, or they can recognize that the old system is dead and adapt to the new one. Victoria was escorted from the hall. When the doors closed behind her, silence fell across the chamber. Elena moved to stand beside Caedric. That was a declaration of war against every corrupt merchant network in the Northern Territories. Good. Let them come. Let them test whether greed is stronger than governance built on actual accountability. She studied his face. You enjoyed that, watching her realize she lost. I enjoyed justice. There is a difference. Is there? The question hung between them like smoke. Caedric turned to face her fully. You are asking if I have become the thing Matthias described. If I am using justice as an excuse for brutality. If I am rationalizing tyranny through claims of reform. I am asking if you can tell the difference anymore. The words landed like artillery fire. Caedric looked around the great hall where 6 generations of Ashborne dukes had ruled through fear, intimidation, and concentrated power. He thought about his grandfather selling influence to a woman who viewed people as assets. He thought about his father trying to clean up that corruption and nearly destroying the duchy in the process. He thought about Matthias calling him a sociopath in open court and meaning every word. And he thought about Elena standing beside him offering partnership when he had nothing left except rage and the knowledge that isolated authority had failed spectacularly. I do not know if I can tell the difference, he said quietly, but I know you can, and I know I trust your judgment more than my own instincts, so I am asking you, have I become someone you can no longer recognize? Elena was silent for a long moment. Then she took his hand. You arrested a woman who tried to buy your duchy. You did it using legal mechanisms instead of simply having her killed. You documented evidence instead of relying on autocratic authority. And you are standing here asking me if you crossed a line instead of assuming your actions were justified. She moved closer. No. You have not become what Matthias described. You have become something he refused to believe was possible, a ruler who questions his own decisions, who accepts accountability, who understands that power without restraint is just another word for tyranny. But I still feel the pull toward domination, still want to crush opposition through force instead of negotiation. Everyone feels that pull. The difference is whether you act on it or choose differently. And if I act on it, then I remove you. Exactly as I promised. The certainty in her voice was absolute. Caedric pulled her close, feeling the weight of everything they had survived pressing down like physical force. I need you to promise me something else. What? When this is over, when we have defeated every conspiracy and neutralized every threat, I need you to tell me if I have lost the ability to be human, if I have transformed into someone who sees people as assets instead of lives. Elena pulled back to look at him directly. You are asking me to measure your humanity. That is a heavy burden. It is the burden of partnership, of trusting someone else to see what you cannot. She reached up and touched his face. Then I promise. But you need to promise me the same thing, because power corrupts everyone it touches, including me. And I need you to tell me if I start using our partnership as justification for actions that serve my ambition instead of duchy welfare. I promise. They stood together in the great hall while morning light shifted across stone floors and guards quietly filed out to give them privacy. General Blackwood was the last to leave. He paused at the door. That was the right decision. Arresting her instead of simply making her disappear. It demonstrates you are building something legitimate. Or it demonstrates I am building a more sophisticated version of the same corruption, Caedric replied, just with better documentation. Blackwood smiled. Your father would have had her killed and buried the evidence. Your grandfather would have negotiated a profit-sharing arrangement. You arrested her using legal procedure and transparent evidence. That is not sophistication. That is evolution. He left, closing the door behind him. Elena moved to the window overlooking the gardens where roses bloomed in patterns unchanged by conspiracy or violence. What happens now? Now we govern. We implement the reforms we designed. We demonstrate that shared authority is sustainable. And we wait to see if Victoria's allies attempt retaliation or recognize that the old system is dead. And if they attempt retaliation, then we fight. Again. Because power attracts predators, and predators never stop hunting. She turned to face him. But we fight together, as partners, as equals. Because the moment we start fighting separately is the moment we become vulnerable to the same tactics that nearly destroyed us. Caedric joined her at the window. I love you. I need you to know that. Not as performance, not as strategic declaration, but as truth. You are the only person who has ever made me question whether power was worth the isolation it required. Elena took his hand. I love you too, and I need you to know something equally true. I did not partner with you because I thought you were perfect. I partnered with you because I recognized someone willing to transform, willing to question, willing to build something better than what he inherited. They stood together, watching roses bloom across gardens that had witnessed more Ashborne blood than beauty. And in that moment, Caedric understood something his father and grandfather had never learned. Power was not measured in wealth or territory or the ability to make men obey. Power was measured in the courage to share authority with someone who could destroy you, in the willingness to question your own instincts, in the strength to choose partnership over domination, even when domination was easier. 6 months later, Victoria Vexley was convicted of commercial fraud and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Her merchant networks were dismantled and absorbed into duchy operations restructured under transparent oversight. The trial revealed connections to 8 other aristocratic families engaged in similar corruption. Parliament launched investigations that would occupy the Crown Prosecutor for years. Matthias remained in Edinburgh, serving his sentence in relative isolation. He wrote letters occasionally. Caedric did not respond to them. Some wounds required distance instead of reconciliation. Lord Sebastian Ashborne was stripped of his parliamentary seat and exiled to a minor estate in Scotland where he lived in bitter obscurity. And Ravenscar Keep continued functioning under co-governance that slowly, grudgingly, began to demonstrate that shared authority was not just sustainable, but superior to autocracy in ways that terrified every duke who ruled through concentrated power. Caedric stood in the study that had belonged to his father, reading reports on agricultural yields and infrastructure improvements, while rain hammered against windows in patterns that reminded him of the morning he had knelt in mud outside his own fortress. Elena entered carrying correspondence from Parliament. They want you to testify about governance reform, share insights on how co-governance functions, potentially serve as a model for other territories considering structural changes. And what did you tell them? That we would consider it. But that testimony requires both dukes, not one speaking for the partnership. Good. She moved to stand beside him at the window. Do you ever regret it? The transformation, the sharing of power, the constant accountability. Every day, Caedric admitted, I still feel the pull toward isolated control, still want to make decisions without consultation, still believe I could govern more efficiently alone. But I also understand that efficiency without legitimacy is just tyranny with better organization. And legitimacy requires partnership, accountability, the willingness to be questioned. He turned to face her. You changed me, not by demanding it, but by demonstrating that strength and vulnerability were not mutually exclusive, that admitting uncertainty was not weakness, that trusting another person with authority was the bravest thing I could do. Elena smiled. You changed me too, showed me that integrity without power is just philosophy, that ideals require implementation, that building something legitimate meant accepting the messy reality of governance instead of demanding theoretical purity. They stood together watching storm clouds gather over cliffs that would witness future generations of Ashborne rulers face similar struggles between power and partnership. Outside, the northern territories continued functioning. Fields were worked, ships sailed, families prospered under governance that prioritized their welfare without sacrificing efficiency. And in the great hall where ducal authority had once been wielded by isolated tyrants, 2 chairs sat side by side, equal height, equal authority, equal proof that transformation was possible even for men who had believed power meant standing alone. Years later, historians would debate whether the Ashborne co-governance model was revolution or evolution, whether it represented genuine reform or sophisticated autocracy disguised as partnership, whether Caedric Ashborne had truly changed or simply learned to perform transformation while maintaining underlying patterns of control. But the people who lived under that governance knew something the historians could not measure through documentation. They knew the Duke who returned from exile was not the same man who had been thrown into rain and mud. They knew he had learned to share authority without diminishing his strength. They knew he had chosen partnership over domination, even when domination was easier. And they knew that sometimes the greatest acts of courage were not performed on battlefields or in parliamentary halls. Sometimes courage meant standing beside another human being and admitting you could not do this alone. Sometimes courage meant trusting someone else to hold you accountable. Sometimes courage meant transforming yourself so completely that the person you had been would not recognize the person you became. Caedric Ashborne had been called many things: the Iron Duke, a sociopath, a tyrant, a reformer. But the title he valued most was the one Elena whispered in the darkness of their private chambers, when political performance was unnecessary and honesty was the only currency that mattered. Partner, equal, human. The rain continued falling across Ravenscar Keep, washing away the evidence of violence and conspiracy and corruption that had nearly destroyed everything they built. And in the study where 6 generations of Ashborne dukes had planned campaigns of conquest and control, 2 people sat together reviewing documents that would shape the future of governance in ways neither could have predicted when this story began. The Empire of Ashes had been rebuilt, not through domination, but through partnership, not through fear, but through the courage to trust, not through isolated strength, but through the understanding that true power was not something you possessed alone. It was something you shared with the one person brave enough to stand beside you and demand you become better than what you were. And in that sharing, in that demand, in that transformation, they had built something that would outlast them both. A legacy measured not in territory or wealth or the number of enemies destroyed, but in the simple revolutionary truth that power without partnership was just another word for loneliness. And loneliness, no matter how efficiently governed, was still a prison. They had escaped that prison together, and the world they built in its place was worth every sacrifice required to make it real.